New York, September 8, 1755. A game of tactical espionage between Major General William Johnson and French Commander Baron de Dieskau comes to a head during the Bloody Morning Scout just inland from the shores of Lake George, New York. A contingent of French Canadians and their native allies lay in ambush for the single column of 1,200 provincial troops and Mohawks heading to reinforce Fort Lyman in a hooked-shaped trap along the Wood Creek Road. One of the Franco-Allied natives discharged his weapon early, before the approaching column could be fully ensnared into the ambush, allowing the provincials the opportunity to stage a fighting retreat while still incurring heavy casualties. The 170 Mohawk warriors leading the British Continental Column would receive the worst of the attack, with dozens of their men, as well as their beloved leader Chief Hendrick, cut down during the affair. After all hell had broken loose that morning for the British colonials and their Mohawk allies, the steely resolve of Colonel Nathan Whiting proved a decisive factor, as he took charge after the consecutive deaths of Chief Hendrick and Massachusetts Colonel Williams. The quick-thinking colonel from the Constitution State, bringing up the rear of the column, instructed his men to find cover along the Wood Creek Road, opening a path for the retreating Massachusetts and Mohawks. The French Canadians would have the heavy casualties they had just inflicted upon the colonials returned in kind, as they were slain in large numbers during the overzealous pursuit. As the provincials and Mohawks made their dash back to camp, Major General Johnson commanded his forces to prepare for a follow-up assault from Dieskau and his men. Cannons were brought forth from the makeshift fortifications inside the camp and aimed towards the road. Uprooted trees were laid strategically on their sides, and wagons were overturned to provide cover, while marksmen scurried about looking for lethal vantage points. While the makeshift defenses were not flawless, they gave the colonials nearly 100 yards of open foreground to fire upon the French should they attack using the road leading to camp. For the better part of the next 90 minutes, survivors of the ambush made their way back into Johnson's camp. A medical tent was designated for the wounded, and a chaotic scene unfolded as wounded were tended to, and preparations were simultaneously made for a massive assault. Captain Eyre was designated command over the artillery. 18 and 32-pound cannons were aimed towards the road the French would almost certainly be traversing to strike. Around noon, Whiting's men gave up their fighting retreat and sprinted the remaining 3/4 of a mile back to camp. Johnson's camp was located 300 yards from the lake, with a hill on the left and an extensive swampy hollow on the right, his front being no more than 200 yards across. Once all of his men had taken their positions, the regimental roll call went from left to right as follows. Fitch's Connecticut companies of the 1st New York Regiment, 1st Connecticut, 2nd Connecticut, and 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Massachusetts on the right. It is assumed that the 1st Rhode Island were divided up as they streamed back into camp after the Bloody Morning Scout and took up arms where the officers deemed necessary, which was typically upon the flanks and as a reserve force. Eyre had placed 3 heavy cannons on the road between the 2 Connecticut regiments, with a 4th on the left between the 2nd Connecticut and 1st New York. As the colonials locked into their defensive positions, Dieskau, after pursuing the provincials for over 3 miles down the road, called a halt to the men's march, only half a mile away. The French commander believed that it was necessary to strike against Johnson's forces in a quick and decisive manner in order to break through their line to victory. Dieskau ordered 220 of his men of the Lorraine and Languedoc regiments to assault the camp with a bayonet charge. The grenadiers were intended to bust through the teeth of the provincial defenses, creating the opening for a fatal follow-up attack. The provincial forces were for the most part rather modestly trained and outfitted. However, they did have an advantage in regards to the wilderness style of fighting, being unencumbered by the traditional continental European style of forming into lines and columns. They were awestruck by the sight of the professional French troops advancing on their camp as they appeared on the road ahead. Phineas Lyman would write of the occasion, "Their arms glistened like the sun with their bayonets fixed, and as confident, I suppose, of coming straight into our camp and carrying all before them as ever any army was." The provincial men, who anxiously held their positions behind fallen trees and overturned wagons, would be experiencing a more traditional battle for the first time, all of the horrid realities of which would soon unshakably consume them. General Johnson, sensing the quiet desperation of his men, rode about his lines on horseback attempting to animate and embolden his people. The grenadiers stood tall and marched towards the provincial line, just out of range of enemy marksmen. The French legions fired off a series of volleys upon the provincial regiments, but this first offensive outburst did little damage. The colonial response would be a different story, as the New England and New York soldiers let loose a volley of their own, accompanied by several loads of solid shot blasted from Ayer's cannons. It was written that their effect was to cut lanes, streets, and alleys through their enemy. The psychological edge held by the French had turned on a dime, and the grenadiers scattered from their lines and sought cover in the woods around the camp. Even more devastating than the casualties suffered from the cannon fire for the French was the native allies' reaction to the sight of the opening exchange. Not wishing to become cannon fodder for the condescending Dieskau, and not desiring to engage in a battle against their Mohawk cousins, they would stay in the woods throughout the battle, disregarding any orders from Dieskau to advance. With the death of their highly favored leader St. Pierre that morning, Dieskau had little recourse for going about changing their minds. The Canadians seconded their Abenaki and Nippising allies and refused calls to advance into the open fire of the provincials. Dieskau, now losing authority and options, knew that if he were to break through the provincial defenses, he would be resigned to doing so using only his European regulars. General Johnson had been shot in the butt with a French musket ball during the initial exchange. While he was in considerable pain, the wound did not appear gravely serious. It would, however, force him to seek treatment in a medical tent, putting Phineas Lyman in command of the battle. The unnerved and poorly trained provincial troops were loading their muskets and firing with a fevered pace, albeit very inefficiently, so much so that Lyman ran from one end of the line to the other, bellowing out to his men to save their fire. Had the men exhausted their munitions recklessly, they would become sitting ducks waiting for the French to engulf them. Lyman's orders were quickly implemented by the soldiers, and he would write of their performance, "Never men nor mortals fought better in the world." Peter Wraxall would offer a different recounting on behalf of the conduct of many provincials that fateful day. "Great numbers of our men hid themselves, and many feigned sickness." Wraxall attempted to rouse the objectors back to their lines, but it was done so with little effect. All the while, the French regulars continued their attempts to bust open the center of the provincial line. While the Connecticut regiment stationed near the road suffered the greatest level of casualties from these French charges, Ayer's cannon shot continued to decimate the French. For over 2 hours that afternoon, the gruesome cycle was repeated again and again. With little damage incurred by the colonial encampment and losses mounting among the French regulars, Dieskau finally acknowledged the reality of the situation and attempted to course correct. Dieskau would write, "The regulars received the whole of the enemy's fire and perished there, almost to a man." The focus of his assault would shift to the right side of the colonial line. Stationed there were the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Massachusetts regiments, the men of which had spent the battle dealing with the Canadians and natives firing upon them from the tree line. Under the command of Moses Titcombs, the Bay Staters would now be tasked with repelling the advancing grenadiers who had reformed and were now advancing upon them. Ayer aimed his artillery towards the new assault and nearly quelled the pressing French with a series of 32-pounders. As the grenadiers stalled, Titcomb and his lieutenant broke towards a large tree that was downed just in front of his line in an effort to inspire his men through a display of courage and fortitude. Titcomb and the lieutenant were immediately consumed in a storm of enemy musket fire and lay dead on the field of battle just a meter from their original line. Dieskau and his trusted officer, Chevalier Montreuil, sought to formulate an assault with Canadians and natives from their wooded cover behind the advancing French regulars, but were dismayed to find that most had broken ranks and gone back to the site of the morning's battle to pillage and scalp the provincial soldiers they had taken prisoner and left tied to trees. Just after 3, with any hope of overtaking Johnson's line slipping further and further away, Dieskau was determined to attempt one final offensive that would turn this battle of attrition in his favor at last. Dieskau charged forward into the clearing to lead the assault and was immediately shot through the leg. As Montreuil washed the wound with brandy, Dieskau was then shot through the hip. While being dragged from the battlefield by 2 Canadians, one of the men was shot and killed. Dieskau instructed the other to leave him and get to cover. The Canadians and natives who were left began to retreat from the battlefield, leaving the French regulars on their own, at this point exhausted and decimated. Montreuil took command for the wounded Dieskau, He attempted to rally the regulars for another advance, but with the numbers so severely depleted, and the sight of Canadians, Abenaki, and Nippising warriors fleeing through the woods, the Mohawks behind the provincial line began to cry out in triumph. Sensing the culmination of the long day at hand, they began to rush onto the field of battle, climbing over the breastworks and charging forward with unrelenting fervor, their tomahawks raised high over their heads. Provincial troops followed suit, shooting down the retreating French as they chased them from the battlefield into the woods. Then they returned to camp. But the elation of winning the battle would have to be tempered. It was just hours from dusk, and Johnson's camp had wounded to tend to, prisoners to interrogate, and a potential follow-up assault from French reinforcements to prepare for. One of the prisoners brought into camp was Dieskau, who suffered a fourth gunshot wound when a New Englander suspecting him of retrieving a weapon shot him through the bladder while attempting to remove him from the field of battle. A group of Mohawks later attempted to execute the French commander, but General Johnson was able to step in and dissuade them from this course of action, sparing the French commander's life. While the reprieve from battle was much needed by the men, the engagement was not over, and in fact, the bloodiest part of the affair had yet to even take place. The previous night, when Johnson dispatched wagoneer Jacob Adams to Fort Lyman to warn them of a coming assault, Adams was shot down and killed after unknowingly riding through the French camp. These gunshots were heard by scouts dispatched from Fort Lyman. After a council of war the following day was held at Fort Lyman, it was determined that Captain Nathaniel Folsom and his 143 men of the New Hampshire Regiment, along with Captain William McGinnis and 90 men of the New York Regiment, would depart Fort Lyman to gather further intel. While traveling up the military road, the ever-growing sound of cannon fire and muskets could be heard in the direction of Lake George. Folsom and McGinnis agreed they should forego their orders and head towards the battle, with the expectation that Johnson was under attack. Just after 5 o'clock that afternoon, the provincials happened upon the location of a few hundred Canadians and Indians who had fled from the battle at Johnson's camp. They were resting near a small pond when Folsom and his New Hampshire men rushed forward and immediately unleashed a blitz of musket fire upon them. After a half a dozen rounds of fire were exchanged, the New Yorkers arrived and assisted in the firefight. For nearly an hour, the hostilities carried on. When the momentum began to fade, the determined captain led a small group of his men in a charge against their foe. The exhausted Canadians and natives, still fraught from the day's long battle at Johnson's camp, fled from their position, ceding the ground and their positions to the victorious provincials. The New York and New Hampshire irregular troops' collective gaze was now transfixed upon the innumerable slain bodies of their enemy combatants, as they disposed of them by dumping their still warm corpses into the small body of water the natives and Canadians had been resting beside, turning its murky waters a deep and ghastly crimson. The waters, and the affair itself, would forevermore be known as Bloody Pond. Captain McGinnis had been shot through the head and was dying quickly, and after much debate, Folsom announced the men would head out from the pond at daybreak the following morning. The men would get no sleep that evening, as they anticipated a raid from the enemy they had just driven away. When morning finally came, they traveled through a grisly scene painted with the horrors of the prior day's events. Corpses lining the road and woodline, some having been shot in the battle, others tied to trees where they were executed, scalped, and at times further desecrated. The British colonials had at last won a pivotal battle, turning back the French from what would have amounted to an undeterred line of attack towards Albany, and from there, perhaps even New York City. The cost was high, with a combined 670 dead across the 3 stages of the battle. Johnson had lost 18 officers. The Massachusetts regiment incurred the worst of the casualties, with 70 killed, and 60 Mohawks, including Chief Hendrick, perished in the fighting. The French toll stood at 149 dead, 163 wounded, and 27 taken prisoner, including Baron de Dieskau, who would survive his many wounds and be sent to London, where he would remain for the duration of the war. General Johnson and the Commander-in-Chief Shirley would further their rivalry after the Battle of Lake George, with disagreements on whether to consolidate their gains with the building of a strong fortification, or continue the expedition to the north shores of Lake George and overtake Crown Point from the French to gain a clear path to Montreal. The victory would boost morale amongst the colonies, and resurrect the aspirations outlined in the failed Braddock expeditions. But the 7 Years' War was still in its infancy, and there was much blood yet to be shed. But for tonight, those are other stories for other times. Apalachicola River in southwest Georgia, November 30th, 1817. A U.S. Army boat transporting supplies, along with 26 soldiers, 7 soldiers' wives, and their children, chart a path across the stream in modern-day Decatur County, Georgia, under the command of Lieutenant Scott. The air is brisk, but as the party approaches the confluence of the Apalachicola and Flint rivers, an eerie and unsettling sight befalls their eyes. Dozens of native warriors begin to appear standing and glaring upon them from the riverbanks. Yet most of the passengers upon this U.S. Army vessel can scarcely imagine the unmitigated horror that will soon be unleashed upon them, the massacre that will follow, and the haunting recollections of it that will unnerve the American population and set forth events that will reshape the geopolitical landscape of the American South for centuries to come. Tensions between the native populations of the South and the empires who laid claim upon their territories, be it France, Spain, Britain, or the newly birthed United States, had been in an ongoing struggle for many years, with various alliances with and against one another. From the recent Patriot War of East Florida that saw President Madison's desire to expand American territorial holdings in Florida from Spain, to the Creek War that saw soon-to-be President Andrew Jackson engaged in fierce combat with the Red Stick people over territories in the Deep South, to involvement by natives in the War of 1812 between the United States and Britain. A bloody tapestry was weaved through the recent history of the land. As periods of factional peace bled into smaller and larger conflicts, it seemed as though the fighting would never cease. The Scott Massacre marked a significant elevation in the hostilities that had been going on between the United States and the Lower Creek peoples, as well as the Creek's offshoot, the Seminole Nation. U.S. forces had sought the arrest of Seminole leader Neamathla, and, after repeated attempts in getting him to present himself were denied, an American expedition to his village of Foultown was led by Lieutenant Colonel Matthew Arbuckle of the 7th U.S. Infantry Regiment. Neamathla is a name of Creek origin, meaning fat warrior, though the title also meant large and exceedingly brave. And the Creek leader would demonstrate the accuracy of this description throughout the rest of his life. The incursion into Foultown had taken part in 2 exchanges. First, in a brief firefight that had resulted in a few casualties for the natives, including a woman, after which Neamathla retreated his people to the confines of a swamp, a tactic that would be used repeatedly by the natives throughout the entirety of the Seminole Wars. While the skirmish had certainly elevated tensions between the two parties, the return of American forces on the 23rd of November would turn the dispute into a bitter conflict of survival for Neamathla and his people. As the Americans returned to Foultown to find it abandoned, they discovered the natives' stockpile of corn and began to load it out in wagons. The corn reserves were absolutely critical to their survival of the upcoming winter, and upon learning of this action, Neamathla launched an assault on the Americans that resulted in several of the native warriors being shot down. They felt even though the odds of success in battle were grave, they would be condemned to a bleak and starved existence in the coming months if they did not take swift and decisive action. Whatever hopes there had been for peace between the Americans and the Creek and Red Stick peoples were now dashed. The incidents at Foultown had enraged thousands of southern natives. Large parties of warriors began moving to reinforce Neamathla and to block off the Apalachicola River to prevent the movement of supplies to Fort Scott. Revenge weighed heavily on their minds, and it would soon manifest itself in an abhorrent and grisly form. Major Peter Muhlenberg held command over supply ships making their way upriver on the Apalachicola. The major was unsettled that General Gaines had failed to deliver him significant help in his endeavor. When Lieutenant Scott reached his flotilla, he had but his single vessel, and only 40 men under his command upon it. Muhlenberg was unaware of the events of Foultown. He would replace half of Lieutenant Scott's able-bodied men with sick, unarmed soldiers, 7 soldiers' wives, and 4 children. Then load the vessel with as much regimental clothing as he could, and send them on towards Fort Scott. Lieutenant Scott carried with him a message to be delivered upon his arrival to the fort, requesting additional support be sent down to Muhlenberg, but it was a message that Scott would never be able to convey. The lieutenant did not encounter any difficulties upon the first leg of his journey. However, Scott was unnerved by the increased presence of warriors along the riverside. They were still unaware of the events of Foultown, but would soon learn of it upon their arrival to the Spanish Bluff, where a couple of traders had built their homes. The men had lived among the natives for years, dating back long before the War of 1812. Scott was shocked to hear of the hostilities at Foultown, and the traders gave him a dire warning that hundreds of Seminole, Maroon, and Red Stick warriors were now descending upon the Apalachicola in support of Neamathla. The traders implored Lieutenant Scott to hold off on the remainder of his mission until reinforcements could be sent from the fort to protect them. Attacks upon boats on the river by the Seminole and Red Sticks were inevitable. Scott wrote to General Gaines and informed him of the gentleman's advisement by name. Quote, "Mr. Hamley informs me that the Indians are assembling at the junction of the rivers, where they intend to make a stand against those vessels coming up the river. Should this be the case, I am not able to make a stand against them. My command does not exceed 40 men, one half of which is sick and without arms. I leave this immediately." There can be no doubt, after reading that letter, that Lieutenant Scott was fully aware of the dire circumstances he now found himself within. Yet, he was unwilling to delay his voyage another moment in spite of these startling revelations. It would take the courier 2 full days to deliver the message to General Gaines. Perhaps Scott had expected the correspondence to arrive much sooner, and for relief to arrive before he reached the dangerous confluence of rivers where an attack was most likely to take place. But whatever the reasoning, Scott had just made a confounding miscalculation that would bear from it dreadful consequences. Lieutenant Scott continued up the Apalachicola River from Spanish Bluff, fully aware of the threats he faced. General Gaines would question the move by Scott in the aftermath of what was soon to follow. Quote, "It appears, however, by a letter from Lieutenant Scott, received about the hour in which he was attacked, that he had been warned of the danger which awaited him. I must therefore conclude that he felt it his duty to proceed. Whether he had received from Major Muhlenberg a positive order to this effect, I have not learned." After leaving the home of the traders upon Spanish Bluff, the depleted men of Scott's vessel rowed hard against the high waters of the river. While very little is known of the construction of the ship, aside from its long oars, its size enough to hold 50 individuals, along with a decent supply of cargo, and that it was uncovered. The primary defenses of the boat, and the only ones of consequence, were the 20 muskets carried by the able-bodied soldiers aboard. Tensions rose within the watercraft as the boat made its slow and perilous journey. Survivors of the attack would recount to General Gaines that they had seen hundreds of warriors along the banks of the river after their departure from Spanish Bluff. Estimates ranged north of 500 native warriors having been spotted. On the morning of November 30th, 1817, the vessel approached the confluence of the Flint and Chattahoochee River, and the bloodiest day of the First Seminole War had now commenced. Only a handful of survivors would live to recount the gruesome events to follow. The chilly late November air caused a shiver amongst many aboard Lieutenant Scott's vessel, nearly half of which struggled with fits of brutal fever that had gripped several of the soldiers. While they suffered physically, the pressing concern was the appearance of the dozens of Creek, Seminole, Yuchi, and African Maroon warriors. Scott's boat came around a bend in the river, revealing they were just 2 miles ahead of the confluence of the rivers. The river was in the early stages of its winter rise, making the current even stronger. As they neared the widest part of the bend, the fast-moving waters pushed the boat from the center of the river near the east bank. The men aboard rowed fiercely against it, but the current ran hard into the side of the boat, pushing it even closer to the perimeter. Hundreds of warriors waited in the thick of the bushes and trees just beyond the riverbank, their faces streaked with war paint, rifles at the ready. They came from all over, and some were even residents of Foultown. Some spoke English, Spanish, French, or Muskogee. The high command of this broad contingent was Homathlamiko, a Red Stick chief from Alabama. Though he is recognized as the commander, the men would function as uniquely assembled war parties, all acting independently of one another, but to the end cause of the same vicious outcome. They combined to outnumber the men of Scott's craft more than 25 to 1. Scott and his men were preoccupied with getting their boat through the bend and back into the strait of the river when the first shots were fired upon them. Recalled by one of the survivors, quote, "The Indians had formed along the riverbank and were not discovered until the fire commenced, in the first volley of which Lieutenant Scott and his most valuable men fell." The opening volley had managed to cut down Scott and the majority of his men who could mount any significant defense of the vessel. They fell before even so much as firing a single shot that day. The confederation of warriors that lined the east bank gave out an eclectic mash of spirited cries. Their sounds of gunfire and hollering drowned out the fearful bellows of the women and children, and the agonizing groans of the American wounded on board their doomed mission. A soldier known only by his last name, Gray, had been badly wounded in the opening salvo of the native coalition. He would be one of the few survivors, and recount that fateful morning around a campfire at Fort Scott. The account was recorded and told to Major Thomas Woodward. Quote, "As those on board were hooking and jamming near the bank and opposite a thick canebrake, the Indians fired upon them, killing and wounding most of those on board at the first fire. Those not disabled from the first fire of the Indians made the best fight they could, but all on board were killed except Mrs. Stewart and 2 soldiers, myself and another man whose name I have forgotten, if I ever knew it. They were both shot, but made their escape by swimming to the opposite shore. 6 or 7 soldiers had actually survived the attack. The Mrs. Stewart referred to in Gray's account was Elizabeth Stewart, the wife of a 1st Brigade soldier. Her husband was not on board. Of the 11 civilians present, only Elizabeth would survive, with 1 being abducted." Gray recounted that after the first volley, the boat ran aground in the shallows of the east side of the river, and that many warriors converged upon the vessel. The only significant resistance in the entire disastrous event by the Americans came from Sergeant Frederick McIntosh of the 7th Infantry, who made a valiant last stand. Quote, "When he found all on the boat were lost, and nothing more could be done, he went into a little kind of cabin that the lieutenant had occupied as his quarters, in which was a swivel or small cannon. He loaded it, took it on the deck, and resting the swivel on one arm ranged it as well as he could, and with a firebrand he set off the swivel, which cleared the boat for a few minutes of Indians. At the firing of the swivel he was thrown overboard and drowned." This defiant last act in the face of assured defeat allowed badly wounded Gray the opportunity to swim to the west shore of the river and escape the massacre. Scott was found still alive but wounded by the natives. He was killed by having hunks of fatwood hammered into his body and then set afire. It was, quote, "an excruciating form of execution that had its roots deep in the ancient traditions of the Creek Indians." The shocking events of the Scott Massacre had stoked the fire of the Americans even higher than their contemporaries after the incursion at Foultown, and now, with both sides inflamed and at one another's throats, the stage would be set for a dramatic conclusion to the First Seminole War. Gray would recuperate from his injuries at Fort Scott through the winter, and he was still taking his quarters there when the man who would bring this conflict to a violent conclusion arrived in March of 1818, Major General Andrew Jackson. But the end to this abrupt and brutal saga is, for tonight, another story for another time. Eagle Pass, Texas, April 25th, 1875. Private Pompey Factor wipes the sweat from his eyes, clearing his vision of the nearly apocalyptic sight before him. Sweeping down upon his position are dozens of incensed Comanche warriors, all intent not only on killing Pompey Factor and his 3 fellow soldiers, but hoping to accomplish this grisly task via the long drawn-out tortures they have become famous for across the frontier. Factor and his mates are well aware that the coming minutes will spell either their doom or their salvation, and that the former scenario is far more likely. Pompey Factor, Sergeant John Barnes, and Trumpeter Isaac Payne, all members of a mixed-race Black and Seminole contingent of scouts attached to the famed Buffalo Soldiers, are locked in a desperate battle with an exponentially larger attacking force of Comanche warriors. Despite the cultural and ethnic milieu present on the battlefield, the U.S. Army has, 10 years after the completion of the Civil War, still not changed their requirement that the officers in command of these units be white. Thus, in command on this day is Lieutenant John Lapham Bullis. However, at this very moment, regardless of their personal backgrounds or the greater ramifications of racial prejudice in United States federal policy, all 4 men are concerned solely with the immediate threat of the Comanche warriors now bearing down upon them. They are all experienced soldiers. Lieutenant Bullis is a respected veteran of the Civil War, and not only have all of these men spent the preceding year fighting the vicious Red River campaign, but these 3 scouts, Pompey Factor, John Barnes, and Isaac Payne, have grown up in lives radically different even from their compatriots serving in what history has come to know as the Buffalo Soldiers. Following the abolition of slavery and the conclusion of the Civil War, the U.S. Army had formed 4 regiments of black soldiers, mostly being former slaves, and wasted no time proving and then repeatedly utilizing the skill and daring of these regiments in their campaigns against the Plains tribes that had reignited with America's post-war revival of enthusiasm for westward expansion and settlement. Though the origins of the term Buffalo Soldier are in fact highly contentious, the prevailing theory is that the hair of the soldiers was unlike anything the Plains tribes were familiar with. They likened the hair of the black cavalry and infantrymen as similar to that of the hair of their buffalo robes, and thus the name stuck. However, one countervailing theory, one likely just as meritorious as it can be corroborated with quartermaster's records, holds that the troopers were one of the few units outfitted with buffalo hide coats to combat the open plains winter chill. The Army supply of wool coats had waned in 1866, and the locally sourced and supplied buffalo coats presented a viable, affordable, and very effective solution to the Army's supply chain conundrums. Thus, oftentimes when a soldier from one of the newly formed regiments was seen for the very first time by a Plains warrior, he would be sporting one of the heavy, full-length buffalo coats. Regardless of the origins of their name, the legacy of the Buffalo Soldiers, even 9 years after their inception, is one of notable gallantry and exceptional courage in combat. Many, if not most of these men in these regiments, see their service as an opportunity to prove their merit and worth in a country that, though it had granted them their freedom, is still deeply divided amongst itself and in many instances openly hostile towards them. They also see it as a chance at adventure, to see lands they have never seen before, and to combat a legendary enemy that most had only heard of. However, this is not the case for their cohorts and what are known as the Seminole Negro Scouts. Though they are indeed of shared racial background with their fellow Buffalo Soldiers, they are in fact part of a rich and storied heritage of escaped slaves who had assimilated into various tribes in the American Southeast. Most prominent among these were the mighty Seminole, themselves a tribe who owned and traded slaves, though they also often fought Southern slavers seeking to recapture their escaped slaves. They also combated the U.S. government's attempts to take over their own homelands and warred incessantly with their hated enemies, the Creek. In the wake of what would become known as the Trail of Tears, the Seminole, along with many other eastern tribes, were forcibly relocated to what is today the state of Oklahoma. This resulted not only in inhumane treatment from the United States government, but in a whole new danger in attacks from tribes native to the area, most notably the Kiowa and the Comanche. After years enduring the misery of their newly imposed locale, a sizable number of mixed-race Seminole, weary of racial tensions and poor treatment from virtually all sides in their new homes, migrated to northern Mexico at the invitation of the Mexican government. Though Mexico had abolished slavery in 1837 and could guarantee, at least in some measure, a reprieve from the antebellum tensions of America in the 1850s, their motives were also arguably less than wholly pristine. Much as they had with the Texans nearly 2 decades earlier, the Mexican government intended to use the settlers on the border as fodder of sorts for the Comanche, Kiowa, and Apache raids that had long terrorized the Mexican settlements to the north. Regardless, though they were no doubt aware of these auspices at least to some degree, large numbers of Seminole and what were known as Seminole Negroes moved south into the mountainous, rough-hewn borderlands that comprised northern Mexico. Here, for nearly 2 decades, they survived and even thrived in an entirely new and notoriously unforgiving environment while under relatively constant attack from Kiowa, Comanche, and Apache raiders. Pompey Factor had been born in 1849, the son of an escaped slave and a mother who had belonged to the Biloxi tribe. His family, too, had grown tired of the constant turmoil of the antebellum South and elected to move to northern Mexico. Though most were staunch Baptists, many, Pompey factor included, were Jesuit-educated and well-read. Following the conclusion of the Civil War in 1865 and the abolition of slavery, many mixed-race Seminole ventured back north of the Rio Grande, and many had enlisted as scouts for the U.S. Army in order to assist in tracking down their old foes in the Comanche and the Apache. Though they are required to furnish their own horses, an expense for which they are reimbursed, and they are subject to the orders of Army officers, the scouts, of which Pompey Factor, John Barnes, and Isaac Payne are members, are far more adherent to Seminole practices and traditions than they are even to the practices of their enslaved predecessors and American cultural peers. Though most wear the blue-jacketed uniform of their Buffalo Soldier cohorts, the mixed-race Seminole scouts also sport the accoutrement of their native forefathers in the forms of leggings, moccasins, necklaces, and in some cases, even headdresses. They are held in awe even by the toughened and already legendary Buffalo Soldiers as unmatched trackers and fighters, capable of traveling unheard-of distances on half rations and doing so repeatedly, day after day, until ultimately tracking down their enemy and emerging victorious. During the previous year's Red River War, they had been used to great effect by General Ranald Slidell Mackenzie, as he had pursued Quanah Parker and those amongst the Comanche in North Texas who refused to acquiesce to being confined to reservations in Oklahoma. They had all served with distinction, including Lieutenant Bullis, who had furthered his record of accord with several instances of personal bravery and selflessness that had solidified his deep affection for and bond with his men. His relationship with his men is described as more familial than militaristic. It was said that every time a scout had a new child, the lieutenant would visit their camp acting in the place of a presiding chief and examine the baby, exclaiming that the child would indeed go on to grow strong and brave. This familial bond is a requirement for men who work in such small teams, in such remote places, under such dangerous conditions. The typical job of the scouts sees them in conditions such as the ones they have found themselves in today on the Pecos River, on a far more frequent basis than any of their comrades in the conventional forces. Lieutenant Bullis, Sergeant Barnes, Private Pompey Factor, and Private Isaac Payne had all been in hot pursuit of this raiding party, with the intention of catching them during the time-consuming job of getting their stolen mounts across the southward flowing Pecos to the western bank and disappearing into the vast expanses of the surrounding landscape. The soldiers had all dismounted and snuck to within roughly 75 yards of where the Comanche were pushing their horses across the river. All experienced fighters, and keen to take the offensive, they had begun firing upon the Comanche, keeping up a relatively steady onslaught for nearly 45 minutes. During this initial combat, the scouts managed to kill 3 Comanche and wound at least 1. At first, due to the rate of fire and sheer ferocity of the attack, the Comanche believed there to be a much larger force attacking them. The scouts are armed with .45 caliber Sharps carbines, as are the vast majority of troopers assigned to serve with the Buffalo Soldiers. These rifles represent a new wave of battlefield technology that has drastically changed the dynamics of combat in the West in the little over a decade since its implementation. Combatants of 10 or 20 years prior were limited to single-shot muskets and rifles whose cumbersome loading processes and maintenance requirements rendered them a liability against foes in mounted warriors capable of firing several arrows inside a minute's time. Though the advent of the Colt revolver had indeed been a massive jump forward for the American forces in combating the Plains tribes, it is only in relatively recent times when the average soldier and scout could count on being equipped with both long gun and sidearms that were capable of comparatively rapid rates of fire. However, as is the course throughout so much of history, this technology does not exist in a vacuum. For nearly as long as their adversaries, the warriors of the tribes on the open plains have been acquiring revolvers and repeating rifles of their own. In this case, here on the Pecos River, this party of Comanche are armed with several Winchester lever-action rifles. Once they are able to discern that the force attacking them is not a sizable contingent of infantrymen, but a small force of 4 scouts, they begin to lay down a withering field of fire with their own weapons. In one of these exchanges, roughly 30 minutes into the fight, Sergeant Barnes' rifle stock is shattered by a Comanche bullet. In short order, the Comanche mount an offensive charge. This charge is the one now bearing down upon Pompey Factor and the other scouts. The nearly instantaneous decision is made to retreat to their horses, mount up, and ride for their lives now that the tide of battle has turned so decidedly. This is commonplace in combat on the Texas frontier, as either side saw little merit in last stands that few, if any of their countrymen would ever even hear about. Now, Factor, Barnes, Payne, and Bullis all reach their mounts staked over a hill only a few yards away, but out of sight. Factor, Barnes, and Payne quickly mount up and, in a matter of mere seconds, are riding north towards the relative safety of their larger conventional forces' brethren. Lieutenant Bullis's horse, however, refuses to allow Bullis into the saddle. Somewhere in the chaos of the fight thus far, Bullis has also incurred a gunshot wound to his right lower leg. Though it is a flesh wound, it renders him significantly less mobile than his men. The horse, driven into a frenzy by the chaos of the battle, now spins in tight circles and nips at the cavalry officer, who can only make repeated and increasingly desperate attempts to ensconce himself in the saddle and retreat. With every revolution of the wild-eyed horse, and every passing second, Factor, Barnes, and Payne get further away from their beloved officer and Lieutenant Bullis, and the attacking Comanche draw nearer. Within moments, the men agree that they cannot and will not leave Lieutenant Bullis to die at the hands of the Comanche. All three men wheel their horses around and charge headlong towards an attacking force that outnumbers them roughly 8-1. The men reach Lieutenant Bullis only moments before they are surrounded by dozens of charging Comanche warriors, whipping around them as though they are a swarm of wasps. This chaotic scene only serves to further frighten Lieutenant Bullis' whirling and wide-eyed horse, who again and again rebuffs the officer's efforts to get one of his boots into the stirrups and hoists himself into the saddle. As Lieutenant Bullis continues his efforts in vain, Factor, Barnes, and Isaac empty their rifles into the oncoming warriors. Almost immediately after his first shot, Barnes's rifle is shot again, the stock completely shattered and the firing mechanism rendered warped and useless. The fight quickly devolves into a hand-to-hand struggle, with Factor, Barnes, and Payne clubbing and stabbing any warrior who rode within striking range as they do their best to dodge incoming arrows and form a loose three-man perimeter around the still struggling lieutenant. Now, the men are again pinned down, as Barnes makes his way to the lieutenant's position while Factor and Payne fight off the remaining attackers before the Comanche retreat to regroup and charge them again. For the better part of 2 hours, the four men fight off charge after charge from the incensed and incessant Comanche warriors, who only become more and more intent on killing their adversaries as more of their comrades fall. Finally, sensing an abatement in the action that might be long enough to grant them an escape, the men make a mad dash north, with Lieutenant Bullis sharing a horse with Sergeant Barnes, leaving the errant crazed horse behind and heading towards Fort Clark, nearly 60 miles away. For the better part of a night and a day, the men make their way to the fort, alternating between carrying Lieutenant Bullis behind them as they continue to scan the countryside around them in search of more Comanche assailants. Finally, all four men miraculously arrive at Fort Clark. Lieutenant Bullis credits them repeatedly and publicly with, quote, "saving my hair." Almost immediately upon their arrival at Fort Clark, Lieutenant Bullis files the necessary paperwork recommending all three enlisted scouts for the Medal of Honor, the United States military's highest award for bravery. On May 28, 1875, Private Pompey Factor, Private Isaac Payne, and Sergeant John Barnes are each awarded the Medal of Honor, making them 3 of 18 total men who served with the Buffalo Soldiers who would earn such a distinction. While there is no record as to the personal thoughts of the men upon being awarded their medals, the events of Pompey Factor's life that followed would go on to speak volumes in posterity. Scarcely 2 years after being awarded his country's highest award for bravery, Pompey Factor and several other former soldiers would decide that their service had still, unfortunately, not garnered them the livelihoods and respect that they had hoped for. In 1877, fellow Buffalo Soldier and Medal of Honor winner Adam Payne would be shot down by Sheriff Clarence Windu at a local party in Bracketville, Texas. Without warning, the sheriff had simply walked up behind Payne and shot him with a single blast from a shotgun that came from such a close range that Payne's clothes caught fire. After his close friend was laid in the Texas ground, Factor and a number of other disillusioned veterans made the move back to Mexico for the next few years. Factor would eventually, however, venture north again, and again volunteer his services in assisting the U.S. Army in 1880. Unfortunately, his military career would also be marred with institutional mistreatment, as when Factor applied for his pension as an elderly man in the 1920s, he was informed that the Army was unable to find his service record. Eventually, his Medal of Honor itself was accepted as sufficient record, and a small stipend was granted. However, Pompey Factor would spend the remainder of his life working as a farm laborer, living in a small shack in Brackettsville, Texas, and eventually passing away on March 28, 1928, at the age of 79. Though the record of his gallantry and commendations certainly placed Pompey Factor in rarefied air amongst military servicemen, his experience outside the Army and treatment at the hands of his own countrymen and government is, regrettably, hardly unique. However, while the stark and unfortunate realities which shaped their experiences are all too important not to forget, it is also just as important to recall the heroism and selflessness of men such as John Barnes, Isaac Payne, and Pompey Factor, who gave their all in fighting for their family, friends, and countrymen. So too, is it imperative to recall the unconquerable nature of the native warriors, still fighting for their way of life despite the increasingly obvious inevitability of their fate. However, the countless tales from all sides of great service, sacrifice, violence, and vengeance are, for tonight, other stories for other times.
August 12, 1840, near present-day Lockhart, Texas. In the humid, burning dawn so common to Central Texas summers, 24-year-old Nancy Darst Crosby sat dejectedly on the back of an unshod, rough-haired pony. Though her skin was terribly sunburnt and her thighs horribly chafed from days of riding, she said nothing, for it would do no good. All she could do was run the events of the previous few days through her head. She and a number of other captives, mostly women, had been taken during a series of brutal Comanche raids along the South Texas coast. They had watched their loved ones cut down, their homes burned to the ground, and entire populations of their hometowns scattered into the shallow Texas bays to seek refuge from the attack in wooden merchant ships anchored offshore. They had come all the way to Texas relatively recently, most of them from frontier states like Kentucky, Tennessee, and Arkansas. Nancy herself was the granddaughter of legendary frontiersman Daniel Boone. She had settled in South Texas, married, and given birth to a son only a little over a year earlier. A blissful family life seemed all but assured until the Comanche came on that one dreadful day. They had killed her husband and taken her and her baby son captive. The customary Comanche treatment of women's prisoners would be termed inhumane by any measure, with sexual assault being an assumed norm and the outright killing of captives being a matter wholly left to the whims of their captors. Nancy's whalebone corset had prevented the sexual assault, but her baby had been summarily stabbed to death in front of her when she could not quiet the child's screams. One can only imagine what she felt, only days later, as she faced yet another day of ceaseless torment. This party of Comanche, though typical in their tactics, was highly unusual both in the size and scope of the raiding they had committed. They also presented a strikingly unusual visual. Many wore the traditional breechcloths and leggings, with headdresses made of buffalo horns, feathers, wolf's heads, and one even wearing the skin of a sand crane atop his head. They were armed with bows, arrows, 14-foot lances, shields, and a number of pistols and rifles they had procured in trading and raiding. But perhaps the most striking sight in the roving, raiding band was the adornment of its warriors in some of the newest, trendiest fashions of the time. Top hats, new leather boots, blankets, lace, umbrellas, and brass-buttoned coats worn backwards. To top off this bizarre scene, war horses, lances, and shields were all festooned with links of bright red ribbons. The sheer size of this force was also a highly unusual factor that day. Comanche raiding parties usually struck swiftly and scattered immediately after a raid. But this party included the wives and children of the warriors, for this was no ordinary raid. It had started when the Comanche chief Buffalo Hump had awakened one night having seen a vision in his dreams. Only weeks earlier, The Comanche had suffered the loss of many of their greatest war chiefs in what came to be known as the Council House fight. The Comanche had brought in a young captive white girl named Matilda Lockhart in order to trade her surrender for goods and an agreement to the cessation of any more white trespassing. But the horrendously pitiable condition of the young girl caused such an uproar in the city of San Antonio that an arrest was attempted. When that was resisted, the chiefs were shot down. It had been a seminal event in recent Comanche history, and Buffalo Hump and his band of Panateca Comanche had burned for revenge ever since. But it wasn't until Buffalo Hump reported his vision to his people that a plan for revenge began to materialize. In his dream, he had seen the Panateca and their allies, the Kiowas, driving the white intruders into the waters of the Gulf of Mexico. Those that they were not able to kill outright were expelled from Texas forever. The victory would be glorious, the spoils innumerable, and the redemption for the Comanche total. And, up until this point, Buffalo Hump had proven all but prophetic. The Comanche raiding party had cut a torrent of violence south from the Texas Hill Country to the coast, and now they were on their return trip. But now, three factors were working against them as they made their way back northwest, back to the limestone and cedar of the hill country. First, the bounty they had fought so brutally to ascertain now became a burden. The weight of the iron cookware, cloth, clothing, firearms, ammunition, food, and other sundries, not to mention their terribly traumatized and physically compromised captives, slowed the party's advancement considerably. Secondly, the Comanche had not only broken their typical practice of scattering after a raid, but were following the same trail to get back home that they had used to make their attacks in the first place. This made them easy for trackers to follow, which was not often the case after native raids. This led us to our third and final problem faced by Buffalo Hump and his sizable contingent. They were now being tracked by the Texas Rangers, as well as a number of local militiamen. This made a rapid egress all the more important, yet simultaneously difficult to accomplish. The Rangers, a relatively recently formed force, had thus far presented some of the only consequential resistance to the Comanches in the whole of Texas. They were largely young, violence-hungry men who had come to Texas for the express purpose of tracking, trailing, and killing Comanches. According to several contemporary accounts, at this time, their mortality rate was around 50%. These young men were becoming a sizable thorn in the side of the Comanche, but were simultaneously experiencing a sort of Darwinism via combat in which the weaker and or more unfortunate among them became weeded out via hard, often torturous deaths at the hands of the Comanche. Nonetheless, these bellicose young men armed with revolvers and bowie knives and clad in serapes and buckskin represented the only hope that Nancy Darst Crosby and her fellow captives had left. If they were not rescued before reaching the undulating topography of the hill country, they would be taken onto the prairie and very likely never seen again. Neither the captives nor the captors were aware of just how close the Rangers and their cohorts were, though. While the raiding party made its languid march northwestward, the Rangers were making every move within their power to garner additional forces, as well as track the Comanche. The Ranger ranks included men whose names would become legendary in the annals of Texas history: Bigfoot Wallace, Ben and Henry McCulloch, Matthew Old Paint Caldwell, Ed Burleson, John Tumlinson, and Jack Hayes. Several of the Rangers had been tracking the Comanche with the help of their Tonkawa scouts under their chief, Placido. The Tonkawa are a tribe native to central Texas who had been devastated for generations by Comanche raiding and expansion. All too often unheralded in conventional narratives of the West, native scouts were essentially the only trackers skilled enough to actually find villages that forces like the Rangers and the U.S. Army sought to engage. Their willingness to assist in hunting down and often killing their fellow native peoples speaks to just how deep the divisions could run between tribes. At the same time, local militia forces from around the area were being marshaled under the leadership of the relatively inexperienced Felix Huston. They received word that they were to rendezvous with the Rangers at a designated spot on a small tributary of the San Marcos River, about 40 miles north-northeast of San Antonio. Huston and his volunteers arrived at this spot on what is today known as Plum Creek, dismounted, and waited for the Comanche. They had placed themselves directly in line with the Comanche's path, and it would be only a short time until the lumbering Comanche party came into view. But for all their bloodlust and anger, the relative neophytes to combat on the Texas frontier hesitated. The Comanche party, although composed in large part of women, children, and elderly members, was still far larger than the Texans. Though they had the advantage in position and firepower, plus the element of surprise, Huston was unwilling to make an outright attack on the party until the more experienced Rangers arrived. The Rangers, for their part, were all making their way as fast as possible to the scene, but as some were coming from a variety of locations due to having been out on patrol, the arrival of their full force had been momentarily delayed. Huston was, undoubtedly, in a difficult position. Should he make a cavalier charge, one he was ill-equipped to lead, he might lose many of his own men. Thus, Huston and his volunteers took up a defensive position, hunkering down and preparing to receive the Comanche charge that would inevitably come when they were spotted. Huston's men dismounted, a nearly always mortal mistake in warfare against mounted tribes, and began to pepper the large Comanche party with shots, as well as make half-hearted advances, only to be driven back by Comanche attacks. The Comanche warriors, perhaps the world's best horsemen at the time, began to ride back and forth in front of their people, red streamers whipping in the wind and new top hats flying off their heads. They rode suicidally close to the Texan lines, with some indeed losing their lives to Texan bullets. For the Comanche, though, as has been noted by several military tacticians, these were not offensive attacks meant to unseat the Texans from their ground, nor even necessarily kill them all. The Comanche intention, with their great visual display and seemingly complete disregard for their own personal well-being, was to create a distraction that would be so all-encompassing for their enemy that the retreat of their wives and children would go unnoticed. For roughly half an hour, these exchanges continued. As the Rangers began to arrive and assess the situation, though, they became more and more impatient with Huston's refusal to take offensive action. Just then, a Comanche chief with a resplendent white shield and feather headdress led a charge to within yards of the Texas position. But the Texan bullocks managed to cut him down on his retreat back to his line, and at this point, everything changed. The Comanche, who often believed a warrior's medicine or puha would make him invulnerable to bullets, were so shaken by this that an all-out retreat began. And at this point, the Rangers' patience with Huston had been exhausted. Ben McCulloch, a legendary Ranger captain, exhorted the volunteer commander that, "Now's the time, Captain. Charge 'em. They are whipped." Every second they hesitated meant more distance between themselves and the Comanche, and more importantly, the Comanche's captives. The Texans mounted and the Rangers led the way as a running fight would ensue over roughly 15 miles of rolling prairie and cactus-strewn hills. The Comanche continued westward toward the hillier country around the Colorado River west of Austin. For hours arrows flew, screams and gunshots resounded, and the air was thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the iron-tinged aroma of blood. Bodies of men, women, and children littered the ground. The wounded were shot dead without exception. One Comanche woman's head was stomped into an unrecognizable mass of bone and tissue. Eventually, the volunteers, Rangers, and Tonquin scouts would regroup to assess their losses and to discuss the next course of action. They had inflicted at least 80 dead upon the Comanche and sent them fleeing for their lives into the hill country. By mathematical standards, the Battle of Plum Creek, as it would come to be known, was a resounding victory for the Texans. However, they had only recovered a fraction of the 3,000 head of horses that had been stolen, as well as a fraction of the goods that had been apprehended. And though they had certainly hastened the retreat of their adversaries, the Texans as a whole had failed in achieving their primary objective, the recapturing of the hostages that had been taken by the Comanche. And when the scouting parties were sent out, they came upon the horrific consequences of their failure. Nancy Crosby was found not long before sundown. She had been tied to a tree, presumably crying out and fighting. As the battle whirled nearby, the gunshots and battle cries likely drowned out her desperate pleas to be spared. But she was not spared. Nancy Crosby was mercilessly drilled with several Comanche arrows through her torso. Her death had likely been quick, but certainly not painless. In the last week of Nancy Crosby's life, she had been kidnapped, assaulted, watched her husband and then her baby killed in front of her, and been subjected to endless torment and torture at the hands of her captors. Her only fleeting hope had seemed all too close, and then her life was ruthlessly snuffed out when her rescue was presumably only minutes away. One could be forgiven for thinking that such horrors were the exception, but Nancy Crosby's story was all too common on the bleeding frontier of Texas. This was not the land of dime novels or tall tales. This was an unforgiving place that was seemingly inextricably ensconced in a cycle of violence, grief, and revenge. But, as S.C. Gwynn points out in Empire of the Summer Moon, the deaths of Nancy Crosby and her fellow captives were not the result of random violence. Their lives were seen as currency, as just retribution for the Minnepaneteca Comanche who had been cut down in the streets and courthouse of San Antonio. Those Comanche were killed in retribution for the treatment of the young Matilda Lockhart. Matilda Lockhart had been kidnapped and treated as a subhuman because she was of a people who were trespassing on, killing, and attempting to end the way of life of the Comanche, just as the Comanche had done to the Apache before them. And so the story of the Old West goes, an endless succession of transgression and retribution. Many of the Rangers there that day would go on to legendary careers and fight in some of the most significant battles in the history of Texas. Huston would be forever hampered in his political ambitions by the prevailing, and not wholly inaccurate, perception that he had cost at least some of the captives their lives due to his unwillingness to pursue more offensive tactics. The Battle of Plum Creek would be only the beginning in the Texas conflict with the Comanche. However, it would mark the last time the Comanche would attempt raiding of such a massive scale and scope. The bloodshed in Texas would not only carry on for decades to come, it would only intensify. The tales of raiding, rescue, and revenge in the Old West are innumerable, and rest assured we here at HOKC will do our best to cover all of them. But for tonight, those are other stories for other times.
Bastrop, Texas, February 24th, 1839. In the late winter chill of a placid evening, the citizens of this small village east of Austin find themselves largely engaged with chores and preparations for evening meals. While Texas is an independent republic, having established its independence from Mexico in the Texas Revolution of 1836, it is still a slave-holding territory. Several of the wealthier citizens of Bastrop are slave owners, and thus many of the local inhabitants are slaves, subject to the dehumanizing effects of chattel servitude, even here, on the bleeding edges of Western civilization's westernmost expansion. Adding to the cultural milieu that is commonplace here in 1830s Texas are several Quiche natives, as well as Tejano citizens, native Texans of Hispanic descent. Though all are subject to the stratified racial and economic hierarchy of early 19th century America, here on the Texas frontier, they live under the auspices of a singular fear that is shared by all. That of the incessant, horrifically violent raiding being carried out all across the Texas frontier by the dreaded lords of the southern plains, the Comanche. Time and time again in the preceding decade, Texas settlers found themselves subject to acts of violence and degradation that had scarcely, if ever, been seen by their predecessors east of the Mississippi. Countless homesteads across the Texas frontier had been laid waste to, with entire families killed or carried off into slavery. Torture killings were common, as were all manner of assaults, including sexual and otherwise. The attacks did not discriminate by race, gender, social class, religious affiliation, nationality, nor age. The Apache, the Tonkawa, the Karankawa, the Spanish, and the Mexicans who have inhabited Texas since the early 18th century have all fallen victim to the Comanche. The inhabitants of central Texas in 1839 are but the latest iteration of a people living on the fringes of what had come to be known to the Spanish as Comancheria. The threat of raiding is in fact so pervasive that the town of Bastrop has its own warning system, instituted by Texas Ranger, Texas Revolution veteran, and Texas Army Chief of Staff, Colonel Edward Burleson. In the event of a Comanche raiding party being sighted, citizens are instructed to sound off with a long retort from a bugle-like brass horn, followed by 2 gunshots in rapid succession. Upon hearing this, the neighboring homestead is to repeat the signal until it reaches the vicinity of the town of Bastrop itself. Here, a small cannon will be fired, serving as the call for the local men to muster and prepare for a Comanche attack. However, as the hue of dusk begins to settle over the city of Bastrop and its surrounding farms and plantations, the threat of Comanche violence seems a world away. Then, suddenly, just as most of the town's inhabitants are getting ready to settle in for their evening meal, the high-pitched, monotone intonations of a bugle can be heard in the distance, followed quickly by 2 gunshots. Less than a minute later, even nearer to the center of town, the same piercing retort of a bugle, followed by 2 gunshots, can be heard. Moments later, the cacophonous rumble of a small cannon can be heard roaring from the center of town. The Comanche, it seems, have struck again. As the fighting-age men assemble in the town square, word quickly circulates as to the cause of the alarm. A local family, the Colemans, have been attacked. Though not necessarily unique on the Texas frontier, the story that now spreads like wildfire through the town of Bastrop is sickeningly violent, and demonstrative of the extremely violent, often macabre nature of Comanche raids in Texas. A combined force of Caddo, Waco, and Comanche raiders had struck the homestead of Elizabeth Coleman, a recently widowed mother, and her 5 children. Her eldest son James had been out in the Coleman's fields with a family friend named James Rogers, plowing rows for spring crops. They had been the first to be set upon by the Comanche, who cut them off from retreat to the family cabin. The 2 young men had made their escape through a thickly forested area, but would be too late in securing help for their loved ones. Minutes after abandoning the chase for Rogers and James Coleman, the large force of native warriors fell upon Elizabeth Coleman and her 4 younger children. Elizabeth and the children had been in front of the Coleman's family cabin, working in the garden situated roughly 50 yards from the door. Suddenly, the young mother and her children saw the blood-curdling sight of several hundred native warriors charging towards them at full speed. Elizabeth Coleman had screamed for the children to flee to the cabin, and all but the youngest, 5-year-old Thomas Coleman, had been able to make it. Thomas Coleman, however, was swooped up violently by a warrior on horseback. Seeing this, Elizabeth Coleman had turned course and attempted to help her youngest son. Within seconds of instinctually whirling about in order to pursue her captured child, she had been struck in the throat by an arrow. She had fled back to the cabin, making it through the door and helping her 12-year-old son, Albert Coleman, bar the door to prevent the attacking warriors, now dismounted and assaulting the front door, from gaining entry. Elizabeth had then collapsed, mortally wounded, as Albert Coleman gathered the 3 guns kept at the cabin. Amidst the shrieks of his siblings and the dire condition of his mother, 12-year-old Albert had put up a truly unbelievable fight against the Comanche and their native allies. He fired upon any warrior who managed to breach the door, killing one outright and wounding another. He then raised one of the cabin's floorboards and instructed his younger siblings to hide underneath them and to not make a sound until they heard voices speaking in English. The preteen boy then continued reloading and firing his weapons, pouring out such voluminous fire that the attacking warriors assumed there to be several grown men defending the cabin. Finally, however, young Albert was fatally wounded by a shot from one of the attacking warriors. With his last breaths, he reiterated his instructions to his siblings hidden beneath the floorboards before finally collapsing near the body of his mother. The attacking party of Comanche and their allies had then taken the young Thomas Coleman and carried their attack on to the neighboring farmstead of one Dr. Joseph Robertson. Robertson and his family were not home. However, there were several unfortunate slaves who, without access to firearms, were unable to proffer any kind of defense. 7 of them were summarily taken away by the attacking native forces, destined for lives as slaves amongst the Comanche and their allies. It would be late in the afternoon, several hours after the attack, that a young neighbor of the Colemans named John D. Anderson found the farm said to be curiously silent and devoid of activity. He had been the first to discover the grisly scene at the Coleman cabin, and had managed to rescue the two youngest children hidden under the floorboards. From here, realizing the danger all three of them were now in, Anderson had set the youngsters astride his horse and made a mad dash to Wells Fort, roughly 12 miles to the west. From here, the children were placed under a guard and runners were sent out to the surrounding towns. These runners alerted the first homestead they had arrived at, initiating the chain of warning shots that now cuts through the air in Bastrop. The men from Bastrop and other surrounding counties coalesced their forces at Wells Fort. While gathered at the fort, Jacob Burleson, brother of the famed Colonel Edward Burleson, is elected to take command. Jacob Burleson and his company of rangers and ad hoc volunteers begin searching the area for the Comanche war party they know to be close by. The search continues into the night, and into the next morning, when finally, at about 10 a.m., the large raiding party is spotted near what is known as Post Oak Island, located roughly 4 miles north of Brushy Creek. Though much of the popular lore surrounding such encounters on the Texas frontier is centered on the actual combat, the biggest problem encountered by the Texans combating the Comanche and other native tribes was actually finding their adversary on the vast expanses of the seemingly endless landscape. With this foremost task now accomplished, the Texians pursue their quarry at full gallop. And a classic Comanche tactic, still relatively unknown to their Anglo adversaries in the 1830s, the Comanche now feign a full-scale retreat. The Comanche and their allies make a mad dash for a thickly wooded thicket, while the Texians, starting roughly from a half a mile behind, pursue them in a zigzag course, aiming to cut off any additional path of retreat. As the Texians proceed to within rifle range of the Comanche, they dismount and form a battle line. While this practice was common in the eastern woodlands, here on the open expanses of Texas, it is perhaps the biggest tactical blunder that can be made. As soon as the rangers' and volunteers' boots are on the ground, the Comanche and their allies immediately turn their ponies and make a headlong attack at the now footbound Texians. This catches the Texians off guard and sends the line of men scattering towards their own horses. One of the young rangers, a man by the name of W.S. Wallace, sees his horse panic and race off towards the Comanche lines, instantly becoming a trophy for the native forces. Now on foot and helpless, Wallace makes a sprint in the direction of his comrades in a desperate bid to escape. Seeing the dire straits of his compatriot, Captain Jack Haney turns his mount around, races back towards Wallace, and sweeps him onto his horse. The two narrowly escape a hail of Comanche arrows which would have all but certainly resulted in grievous injury or death. Further down the Texian line, Captain Jacob Burleson, along with Franklin Highsmith and the teenaged Winslow Turner, arrive at their horses just in time to potentially evade the oncoming Comanche charge. However, in their panicked frenzy, the young Turner forgets to untie his horse, which is picketed to the ground. Seeing this, Captain Jacob Burleson turns, rushes back towards the youngster, dismounts, and unties the horse. Turner dashes off, but Jacob Burleson, just upon reaching his own horse, is struck by a gunshot in the back of his head. In the chaos of the retreat, his body is left where it falls. The rangers and volunteers now retreat, roughly 3 miles back towards Wells Fort, before stopping momentarily to rest their horses. As the horses rest, the rangers and volunteers descend into a malaise of anger, self-doubt, confusion, and contention. It is well known among them all that, at this very moment, the body of their countryman and comrade, Jacob Burleson, is being subject to all manner of posthumous mutilations by the Comanche, in both an effort to add literal insult to injury, as well as to hamper the person in the next life. Many tribes customarily practice disfiguring the bodies of their slain enemies. The accounts of those Texas settlers who had found the bodies of their friends and family had circulated amongst every community on the frontier for many years, even at this point in the 1830s. The prevailing opinion amongst the rangers and volunteers alike is that the Comanche must be re-engaged. But the matter of exactly how to go about this presents a conundrum for the bellicose and indignant men. In the midst of contentious discussions on how to further proceed, at around noon, another force of 30 Rangers and volunteers, riding under the command of Captain Jacob Burleson's brother, Colonel Edward Burleson, arrives. Informed of the death of his brother, Colonel Burleson marshals the combined forces, roughly 84 men in total, and the party makes their way back towards Brushy Creek. They ride past the Brushy thicket, as well as the mutilated body of Jacob Burleson. Finding the thicket now empty, the Texians scan the surrounding countryside. They are met with yet another troubling, formidable sight. On the top of a large plateau near Brushy Creek, the Comanche and their allies have marshaled their forces into a large horseshoe formation, ready and waiting to receive the Rangers' forthcoming charge. Colonel Edward Burleson decides that he will divide his forces. He orders one of his officers, Captain Billingsley, to lead half of the men to attack the Comanche and their allies from below the plateau, while another contingent, led by Captain Rogers, will advance up a small ravine on the backside of the plateau. However, upon arriving at their tactical destinations, both officers find themselves roughly 50 yards from the entrenched Comanche position, with nothing but a coverless no-man's land in between the two parties. Now, an entrenched, prolonged battle drags out, with each side taking shots from their positions. One Comanche warrior in particular manages to kill 2 Texians and wound several others, acting as a masterful sniper with his single-shot rifle. Finally, young Winslow Turner locates the warrior's position from the gun smoke rising off of his weapon. Turner manages to climb a small tree, gain an advantage in position, and dispatch the sharpshooting Comanche with a carefully placed shot of his own. Finally, as the sun sets and night falls over the landscape, the Comanche and their allies retreat under cover of the night. As their enemies retreat, the Rangers and volunteers are met with the haunting, visceral cries of the Comanche themselves, mourning the loss of their own beloved friends and family who have fallen that day. In the aftermath of the fight, the brutal, inhumane nature of warfare on the Texas frontier is left all too apparent to the survivors present. The Rangers and volunteers now advance to the Comanche position, finding a singular survivor, one of the unnamed captured slaves taken by the Comanche the day prior. The man lies near death, with 9 arrows protruding from his body in various places. He has clearly been left for dead. But the man not only miraculously survives, he is able to give testimony to Colonel Burleson that the Comanche had carried off roughly 30 of their own dead. The Rangers and volunteers have, for their part, suffered 3 fatalities, including Jacob Burleson. One additional casualty, the Reverend James Gilleland, would die a little over a week later from the gunshot wound he incurred to his neck. In this world of cruelty, hardship, shifting alliances, and seemingly constant violence, the Battle of Brushy Creek provides a notable example of the multifaceted, cross-cultural, and cross-social nature of life on the Texas frontier in the 1830s. Even in the all-too-often macabre history of humanity, the tales of loss, tragedy, and survival in the history of Texas are notable in both scope and intensity. But the many tales of brutality, conflict, and cruelty that line the annals of Texas history are, for tonight, other stories for other times.
January 24th, 1599. Acoma, Pueblo, New Mexico. 26-year-old Spanish Conquistador Vicente de Zaldivar stares angrily into the pre-dawn darkness, mentally rehearsing the plan he and his officers have agreed to. They will make a head-on charge, it has been decided. Their cannon will be put to use. And before the sun sets on another chilly winter's day, de Zaldivar feels assured that victory will belong to himself and his men. They have been ensconced here at the base of this mesa and the sparse expanses of this unforgiving desert for 2 days, laying siege to the natives within the adobe brick walls. But despite their formidable advantage in both firepower and personnel, they have been, as of yet, unable to overtake their intended objective. Their presence here is the inevitable result of 2 worlds colliding. While they are ultimately only the martial enforcement of policies dictated by a king and influenced by a pope,
thousands of miles away, the actions they are about to take will ultimately have reverberations felt throughout both the New and Old worlds. However, while geopolitics indeed plays a role in the attack these soldiers of Spain are about to undertake, they are here today primarily for the sake of their own personal vengeance and retribution. In little more than a century since Christopher Columbus's landing in the Caribbean, Spain's relentless incursion into the Americas has been rivaled only by the British, the French, and the Dutch. Following Hernán Cortés's overthrow of the Aztecs in 1519, the Spanish spread north and westward has been startlingly swift and strikingly violent. The Spanish had founded New Spain, encompassing the vast majority of what today comprises both Central and North Americas, in 1521. For much of the latter half of the 16th century, the Spanish had concentrated significant amounts of their efforts on settling the area. The Spanish and the Acoma people had first come into contact around the year 1540, and for decades had lived in essentially peaceful coexistence. However, in the preceding few years, the Spanish attempts at subjugating the Pueblo peoples of what is today's central and northern New Mexico had become both more concentrated and more consistent. The Spanish governor, Don Oñate, had spent considerable time and resources on settling the region and bringing the native inhabitants to bear as subjects of both the Spanish crown and, simultaneously, the Catholic Church. In 1595, Oñate was granted permission from King Philip II to colonize Santa Fe de Nuevo Mexico, the present-day state of New Mexico. This led to his involvement in devising a plan to overthrow the Acoma chieftains and conquer their pueblo by force. With the full weight of the Spanish crown's oversight now upon them, Oñate feels the Acoma can no longer be allowed to run unfettered about the Spanish territory as unbaptized, disobedient citizens. However, in 1598, his plans for a violent overthrow had leaked to the Acoma, who were rightfully incensed and understandably terrified. Among many Acoma, it was still believed that the Spanish were, with their steel armor and cacophonous firearms, impervious to harm. Also adding to the Spanish air of invincibility is their exclusive access to a technology no natives on the American continent possess: the horse. Since landing in the New World, horses and horsemanship had been closely guarded aspects of European technology that it was believed must never be allowed to fall into native hands. This perception of the Spanish, as well as the Spanish's well-known track record of harshly dealing with their opposition, had led many among the Acoma to advocate for a conciliatory approach to dealing with the Spanish. Well aware of the Acoma's willingness to acquiesce, Don Oñate had sent his nephew, Vicente de Salvador's brother, Juan, to negotiate a peace agreement with the Acoma. This was seen as a Plum assignment and a way to pad the budding young Juan's record as a diplomat and military leader. On December 4, 1598, Juan de Zaldivar had marched up the steep slopes of the mesa with 16 conquistadors under his command and resolutely demanded food. Their trek had been tiresome, and they were indeed in great need of sustenance, but their presumption and aggression had quickly led to a violent altercation with the Acoma. The conquistadors had allegedly assaulted some of the Acoma women, actions which led to the death of Juan de Zaldivar and 11 of the 16 soldiers under his charge. Upon receiving the news of his nephew's demise at the hands of the Acoma, Don Oñate had flown into a rage, promising revenge against them. It was Oñate who had ordered Vicente de Zaldivar to lead the expedition avenging his brother's death. Vicente and his men had arrived at the Acoma Pueblo on January 21st of 1599, and the battle had begun in earnest on the following morning. The formidable walls surrounding the Pueblo had, for 2 days, held the attempts of the Spanish to infiltrate them at bay. Repeated incursions had been made with the hope of a headlong charge being avoided, as well as avoiding the arduous task of hauling their field cannons up the steep, rocky slopes in order to breach the walls. Now, just before the sun's rays pierced the eastern skyline, Vicente de Zaldivar gives his force of roughly 70 men the order to advance. Huddled inside their homes, quieting their children and steeling their own nerves, the Acoma can hear the clattering of the armored Spaniards advancing up the slopes with their artillery in tow. Though they have witnessed the Spanish fire upon them in the preceding few days with their arquebuses, the Acoma have yet to face the full brunt of the Spanish cannons. Though far shorter than their maritime counterparts, the field cannons carried by the Spanish on this day provide a powerful tactical as well as a psychological advantage. The walls of the adobe, though expertly constructed and remarkably durable, are no match for cannonballs. The deafening roar of the cannons also provides a factor of shock and awe that are of comparable, if not equal, value in attacking an enemy as of yet unfamiliar with their capabilities. Just as the morning sun has risen high enough to illuminate the strange actions of the Spaniards as they make ready to fire, the Acoma look on in equal parts curiosity and horror. Moments later, the command to fire the first volley is given, and the placid sounds of the desert morning are instantly drowned out in a roar of cannon fire. Of the estimated 6,000 Acoma inhabitants, roughly 2,000 are full-fledged warriors, now readying themselves for a third successive day of resisting the Spanish onslaught. As they watch the damage being steadily inflicted upon the outer walls of the Pueblo, they come to the chilling realization that soon the only barrier between the cannon fire and their families will be themselves. The Spanish onslaught continues, as the wailing and lamentations of the women and children fill the air. As cannonballs continue to plow into the thick walls, the complications for the defending Acoma begin to compound. Soon, in addition to the emerging gap in the defensive wall, the smell of acrid smoke permeates the air. The dried straw mixed into the adobe has begun to smolder with the incessant heat of the cannonballs assaulting it. Soon, the fire is growing rapidly, as are the panicked cries of the men, women, and children, now all trapped within the confines of the Pueblo. Finally, after hours of bombardment, Vicente de Zalvadar gives the final command for the conquistadors to draw their swords and storm the Pueblo. Within minutes, the several dozen heavily armed and highly trained soldiers pour past the barriers of the walls and into the city streets of the Pueblo. For hours, a bitter, vicious battle rages, in which the Spanish cut down even the most tacit opposition, be they warriors, women, or children. By late afternoon, the Acoma Pueblo's peaceable confines have turned into a smoke-strewn, blood-soaked scene from a nightmare. Roughly 500 Acoma warriors lie dead, most having died courageously in vicious hand-to-hand combat defending their loved ones. Additionally, roughly 300 women and children have fallen to Spanish swords and arquebus fire. Now, as the afternoon sun begins to wane, Vicente de Zaldivar, still seething over the death of his brother, orders 500 of the Acoma villagers placed in chains. Amidst the weeping of children and mothers who would never see each other again, the Spanish summarily marched the captured Acoma off to the San Juan Pueblo, where Governor Don Oñate waits with an abiding fury. Upon his arrival, Vicente de Zaldivar is made the object of Oñate's praise, and the prisoners are made the target of his merciless rage. Initially, the seizing Oñate ordered that every male over the age of 25 should have their right foot cut off, and subsequently enslaved for 20 years. The same period of enslavement was to befall any male prisoner between the ages of 12 and 25, and any female prisoners over the age of 12. Ultimately, 24 of the captured warriors would suffer the totality of their sentences. The rest would be dispersed throughout the Jesuit mission system that had already been established even here on the furthest outreaches of the Spanish frontier. Many of the younger women would ultimately be sent to convents in Mexico City to serve out lives as nuns. 2 of the male prisoners had their hands amputated and were sent out amongst the neighboring tribes as walking warning signs not to contest the newly declared authority of the Spanish crown. It would be King Philip II himself, however, who would issue a personal order banishing Don Oñate from the entirety of the New Mexico territory for good. Even with the ostensible might of one of Europe's most powerful empires backing them, it was readily apparent to the king that such needlessly violent retributive actions would only ultimately cause the Spanish more problems in their attempts to advance their empire and grow their economy. Oñate would eventually retire to Spain, where he would work as the head of all mining inspectors until his death in 1626. Don Oñate presents an incredibly controversial and consequential figure in the story of the Spanish in the New World. He is vilified by many, revered by some, and often heralded as the last of the conquistadors. The end of his story is, however, far from the end of the story of the Spanish incursion into what is today North, Central, and South America. The actions taken by Don Oñate would have consequences that reverberated for decades, ultimately culminating in the largest native revolt in North American history. The tales of bloodshed, coexistence, survival, and heroism are too numerous to cover in a single episode. And so, for tonight, they are other stories for other times. West Texas, 1876. Just as dawn begins to break, a pair of young Apache hunters lope their mounts towards the top of a ridge, being careful to move as quietly as possible, lest they disturb any game in the area. The young hunters are mere teenagers. One is a full-blood Apache named Bobo, riding a fine horse belonging to his father. The other is an adopted member of the tribe. A few years earlier, he had been a German-speaking farm boy on a Central Texas farm not far from today's Mason, Texas. His name had been Herman Lehman, though he barely remembered that now. He had been kidnapped by the Apache with his younger brother Willie, taken while the boys were out watching sheep. The pair had suffered terrible abuse at the hands of the Apache, being starved, beaten, and driven without rest for long periods. Willie had managed to escape, but Herman had not. He had eventually been adopted by the Apache as one of their own. Life with the Apache, though, even once he had been adopted into an Apache family, had been difficult. Life for the Apache, and for any tribe in West Texas for that matter, was hard. The sparse landscape and unremitting conflict with Americans, Mexicans, and other tribes made for a perpetually hardscrabble, violent existence. But, at least for the time being, Herman was now, at least ostensibly, one of them. However, he was not fully Apache, and even his new name was quick to remind him of this every time he was addressed by it. His new name was Inda. It meant white boy. Regardless, Herman, or Inda, had thrown himself into the life of a preteen warrior in training under the often brutal tutelage of his adopted father, a chief named Carnoviste. Carnoviste had been the chief of the party who had initially kidnapped Herman and his younger brother from their family's farmstead. He had initiated the young boy into the brutal realities of Apache life before the raiding party had even made it back to their home village. Food on the trail could be scarce, and the luxury of cooking and eating meals while presumably being pursued was not one that could be afforded. Later in life, Herman would recall being force-fed the raw liver of a calf that the party had happened upon and slaughtered, as well as his repeated failure to keep the meal down. A few days later, the young Texan found his appetite less discriminating when the band discovered a few baby antelope that had been left alone when their parents had scattered at the approach of the oncoming Apache. The baby antelope were summarily scooped up and thrown into a leather sack as the Apache proceeded on to their campsite for the night. After several more hours of riding, they stopped and, for the first time in several days, afforded themselves the indulgence of a campfire. After they had the fire built and a sufficient bed of red-hot coals stoked, the antelope, some of whom were still alive, were thrown onto the fire whole to roast to the Apache's content. In his memoirs, 9 Years Among the Indians, linked to purchase in the description, Herman recalls his mix of admiration and horror when the antelope parents, known to track their young down should they wander off, showed up not far from the camp in an attempt to rescue their imperiled young. The Apache quickly shot both, and soon a great feast was had. For almost everyone, it was the first real meal in a long while and was greatly appreciated. And thus life had continued on for Herman, as he transitioned his mindset and lifestyle from that of a young Deutschman on the Texas farm to that of an Apache warrior responsible for eking out a living for himself and his family in a land that offered little and took much. He had learned, though, how to ride, how to track, how to hunt, and how to fight. The Apache were capable of procuring water from places that seemed to not have seen rain in years. They were renowned for their ability to track animals and people in the dusty, rock-strewn expanses of their homelands. They were also held in high regard as warriors, and feared as raiders in homesteads and hamlets from Utah to Mexico. However, the desert had not always been their home. They had once been the masters of the vast and bountiful expanses of current-day Texas and the southern plains. They had hunted the expansive buffalo herds, harvested from the pecan trees, camped in the meadows, and swam in the rivers and streams. Then, the Comanche had arrived. Over the course of a few decades, the newcomers to the southern plains, who had made their way down from the northern Rockies and made their martial ascent after mastering the newly available horse, had made it their business to systematically remove the Apache from what is modern-day central and southern Texas. The intensity and scope of the Comanche raids that swept into the Apache villages were unlike anything the Apache, or anyone else in Texas for that matter, had seen before. The Tonquin, the Karankawa, the Caddo, the Waco, the Cheyenne, as well as the Spanish and later the Mexicans and Texans, regardless of the target of their wrath, the accounts were strikingly and disturbingly similar. All fighting-age males not killed in defending their families would generally be summarily executed via any variety of torturous methods the Comanche employed over the years. Women would generally be assaulted and exploited, sexually and otherwise, and infants would be killed outright, as they posed too much trouble to a raiding party's egress back to their home territory. Children and preteens and some teens were, after a generally brutal induction process, adopted into the tribe, as Herman was with the Apache. The Comanche, in fact, have one of the most impure bloodlines of any tribe on record. Their male mortality rates were unusually high due to the frequency and ferocity of their combat, and their birth rates were relatively low, with miscarriages being a more common phenomenon among the perpetually horse-bound people. Raids would generally conclude with horses and usable goods being taken, and all homes and crops being burned. The Apache had perhaps suffered the wrath of the Comanche more than any other. Though many of the personal accounts would be lost to history, the sheer rapidity of the Apache retreat from their Texas homelands speaks to the ferocity of the attacks. But the Apache had managed to adapt and survive in their new lands. Though the game was less plentiful, it could still be procured, and thus Herman and Bobo had ventured out away from the relative safety of the camp on this morning. They assume, for all intents and purposes, that they are safe from Comanche attack, as they are already far west of the Comanche's typical range. Their only concern is not spooking any game in the area, and being able to find their way back to their village. Then the boys hear the sound of several hoofbeats coming their way. They are the only warriors who had left camp, and thus they know whoever is coming towards them is not from their village. Before the pair can question each other as to what the source of the noise might be, the answer is made all too apparent, as a large band of Comanche warriors suddenly crest the ridge the young Apache boys are at the bottom of. Their only option now is to flee back to their village and attempt to alert as many of their tribesmen as possible in order to marshal some sort of defense. Bobo's horse, fleet of foot and well-bred, turns and gallops back towards the village at full speed, his rider hugging tight to him by squeezing with his knees and hugging close to the horse's neck while staying low. Herman's mule, meanwhile, is not so obedient. The unfortunate animal has, by Herman's account, been beaten so severely for so long that it had become extremely skittish and even more obstinate than its nature had originally dictated. In this particular instance, as Herman urges the animal towards the Apache village and away from the oncoming Comanche, the mule begins to spin in tight circles rather than running in any direction. As the mule spins faster and faster, Herman calls out to Bobo, begging him to come back and help. But his pleas are to no avail, as Bobo, atop his fine mount, pays Herman no heed as he makes his way back in a full panic towards the Apache village. After a number of revolutions, the animal is struck in the hip by a Comanche arrow. This finally breaks the terrified mule from his panicked spin and sends him in a full gallop in the direction of the Apache village. Herman now hangs on for dear life, as the mule picks up more and more speed, finally passing Bobo. The terrified young man now cries out to Herman not to leave him, as his horse begins to tire and the Comanches gain ground. But, as Herman recalls in his own words, "If I had any intention of waiting, it was forlorn, for that dun mule was on the go. There was no stopping him." The mule, with Herman still clinging on to him, barrels through the Apache camp, knocking over women and children in its manic flee back to the village's horse herd, where, only minutes before there had been a placid camp with many Apache now just beginning to wake, there was now a scene of pure terror and calamity. Upon reaching the village's horse herd, Herman's mule begins to buck, attempting to dismount his rider and rejoin the perceived safety of its herd. Herman manages to safely dismount, jump on the back of another horse, and make his way back to the village. He arrives back just as the fight against the oncoming Comanches, a force Herman estimates to be roughly 40 warriors, is beginning in earnest. The Apache warriors have met the Comanche charge and managed to drive them back. As Herman scans the force of Apache warriors, loosing arrows and bullets upon the Comanche, he searches for the face of his hunting companion Bobo. But he is nowhere to be found. As arrows whiz all around, he notices a contingent of warriors pressing forward toward an area just outside the bounds of the village. Then, he sees the body of his friend, crumpled on the ground. His back is full of thick Comanche arrows, and he has been scalped. The young, carefree hunter who had taken to the wilderness with Herman just this morning was now gone. Unable to process the gravity of these events in the moment, Herman can only express rage as he joins the group of Comanche fighting their way forward to recapture the body of the young warrior. Herman later recounted the events in his memoirs. Every foot of ground was contested. The Comanche were nasty fighters, but we greatly outnumbered them. The battle began about 10 o'clock in the morning and raged most of the day. About sundown, the Comanches withdrew, leaving many of their comrades dead on the battlefield. Never tried to follow them, for 20 of our braves had gone to the happy hunting ground, while 8 more were writhing in pain, 4 of whom died that night in spite of the prayers and incantations of our medicine man. 1 more died the next day, but the other 3 recovered. Our dead were given a decent burial. Herman and his cohorts now moved back to the battlefield, still stinking of iron and slick with blood, to retrieve any usable weapons from the dead Comanche. Guns, bows, arrows, and shields are all collected, as are any horses that are not dead or wounded. The dead Comanche warriors are afforded no respect. They are gathered up and thrown into a hole in the ground, left to the ravages of the wolves, coyotes, and buzzards. The Apache then hurriedly pack their things and break camp, moving north at a rapid pace in case there were more Comanche in the area to be avoided. Scouts are sent out in every direction to scour the landscape for any Comanche in hiding. Soon, 2 Comanche spies are discovered. One is shot and killed outright upon discovery, while the other is captured and hauled in to be tortured. Colonel Viste, Herman's adopted father and the village's chief, cuts holes in both the Comanche's arms, strings a rawhide cord through them, and hangs the warrior up from a tree, leaving him to expire as the Comanches move on. Herman would later recall, with no small amount of disgust, how an old Apache squaw, whose nose had been cut off for infidelity, had felt bad for the Comanche and later snuck back and cut him down. Such soft-heartedness was seen as a reprehensible trait in these harsh environs. Finally, the party arrives at a spring some 60 miles from their previous encampment. They stay for a few days, trying to come to terms with their intermittent, overwhelming grief and rage. One morning, soon after arriving to the spring, an old Apache man wakes in a sweat. He stirs his family awake and tells them of a terrifying vision he has just seen in his dreams. They then report the vision to Colonel Viste, who listens intently as the old man describes his nightmare in detail. He says he has seen a great horde of Comanches chasing after them, and that soon these Comanche would be upon them. A collective pang of terror now sweeps through the village, and the elders come together to hold a council. All day, the Apache abstain from food and drink, and discuss what course of action they might take next. The majority of the Apache advocate for simply packing up and leaving the area altogether, rather than risk greater losses against a foe that had hounded them so incessantly for so long. Thus, Carnoviste and the rest of the village elders agree to pack up and move the village again, making as much haste as possible. The horses and mules are again hurriedly loaded, and the Apache move west. They move along quietly, doing their best to be as discreet as possible in this landscape that offers little in the way of tactical cover. They travel for 20 miles and begin to think that perhaps all of this was much ado about nothing, so much effort spent for the ravings of a sleep-deprived old man. Then, as though they have stepped onto a hornet's nest, the Comanche are everywhere. Somehow, where once the horizon had been bare, are now dozens of Comanche warriors coming at the Apache full bore, loosing arrows all the while. In the minutes that followed, utter devastation was wrought on the small Apache band. 40 of their warriors were killed, most of their women and children were taken captive by the Comanche, and all of their horses, food, and equipment was stolen. The Comanche, for their part, also suffered significant losses at the hands of the Apache, as the Apache had, in this particular fight, more rifles at hand than did their opponents. By Herman's later estimation, roughly 100 Apache warriors, along with 6 women, are able to escape on foot. For a full month, they wander the desolate landscape, barely surviving on what little food and water they could find. Finally, Herman and the other survivors cross paths with another band of Comanche, 150 warriors strong and well armed. They inform this band of the horrors they have suffered over the past several weeks at the hands of the Comanche, and a call is put out, all across Apache territory, for the bands to meet at a known spot on the plains, a dry lake bed known to the entire tribe. As Apache scouts carry the word from camp to camp, warriors begin to pour into the lake bed location from areas as far away as Utah, Arizona, and Mexico. As warfighters stream into the camp, they find it a hive of activity. Herman and all of his fellow warriors are hard at work, making arrows, hardening spear points, cleaning rifles, and reinforcing shields. The Apache had decided that they would no longer bear the brunt of Comanche wrath. The time had come for their people to unite and reap their proverbial pound of flesh from the Comanche transgressors who had, for so long and so egregiously, abused them. They had, many of them felt, reached the point of no return. There was no longer room for both they and the Comanche to exist, and they would now do their best to eradicate them outright and reclaim the homeland that was rightfully theirs. Hatred for the Comanche is so intense that even the women and children are drilled, again and again, in the handling of weapons and potential paths of egress, should their fathers and brothers be overtaken in the great battle to come. For the Apache and Comanche, a time of reckoning is at hand. Even the legendary chiefs, Victorio and Geronimo, come to the camp, ready to make war. It is Victorio himself who volunteers to lead a band of his most trusted scouts out into the west in a preliminary search for any Comanche in the territory. But as days pass, and as more and more Apache pour into the camp, and the pace of preparation becomes even more frantic, there is still no sign of Victorio's scouting party. Finally, the legendary chief straggles back into the camp, barely hanging on to his mount. All of his companions have been killed, he says, and the Comanche now know that the Apache are again encroaching into their territory. A council is again held, where Victorio, Geronimo, Carnoviste, and other chiefs all give their opinions on what to do next. Victorio advocates for peace with the Comanche. He says, "I fear not the Comanche myself, neither am I afraid of their allies, the Kiowa. But these tribes are strong among themselves and greatly outnumber us. Besides, the whites furnish them with guns and powder and lead to help exterminate our tribe. The white man is the Indian's enemy, and the Indians must quit fighting among themselves and all go together to fight the palefaces. While I was gone, on a previous trip, I saw as many palefaces as there are sprigs of grass on the plains or stars in the sky, and if we continue to fight each other, we will all be exterminated by the white men." Red Wasp, another chief, argued that we do not fear the cowardly palefaces. They have robbed us of our hunting grounds. They have destroyed our game. They have brought us disease. They have stirred up discord among our own race. They have intimidated our braves. They have made profligates of our children, reprobates of our wives, and destroyed our traditions. They have wrought despair and desolation to our tribes, and for my part, I am ready to fight until I fall. As to the Comanche, our grievances are great, and the cause of war is just, and I'll be glad to kill them when they come. Kill them as they kill our companions. Kill them, kill them. And if we must die, let us fight to the bitter end. I want to fight. Finally, it is decided that a truce with the Comanche will be attempted. If it can be achieved, perhaps the two tribes can finally present a unified front against the centuries-long incursions of the whites, be they Texans, Americans, Mexicans, or Spanish. The next day, the Apache, under a white flag of truce raised high on a pole, make their way to within 3 miles of the Comanche camp. Soon, a Comanche warrior comes riding toward them. He circles the Apache party from a safe distance, whooping and taunting them, waving a black shield over his head. This is a challenge of war to the death, with all the vanquished being killed, be they warriors, women, or children. Now, the moment of truth arrives. Should the Apaches send out their own warrior, holding up a red shield, the invitation to battle would be accepted, and the fight would unfold. But instead, much to the Comanche's surprise, the Apache rider comes forward unarmed, still flying the white flag of truce. The Comanche, still incredulous, makes signs for 6 of their men to meet 6 of the Apache at a halfway point between the two parties. 6 Apache men are selected to go forward, and they ride out to meet the Comanche. The Comanche, for their part, agree to make peace so long as the offending Apache who had tortured their tribesmen was handed over to be dealt with as they saw fit. The Apache emissaries, very much aware that the offending chief the Comanche were referring to was the very much alive and well Colonel Viste, informed the Comanche that, unfortunately, the Apache who had so mistreated their warrior was unfortunately killed in the earlier battle. Disappointed, but unwilling to pursue the matter further, the Comanche agree to drop the issue altogether and pursue a unified, mutually beneficial peace. Upon this precarious falsehood, a truce is agreed to. The women and children who had been taken captive in the earlier raid are returned to their Apache families, and many tears of joy and celebration are the order of the day. Some of the Apache women even agree to, or are forced to, depending on the account, stay with their captors in order to solidify the relations between the two tribes via marital bonds. They are adopted into the tribe immediately, as is the old woman with no nose who cut down the Comanche. Herman, for his part, is not sad to see her go. Ultimately, Herman credits Victorio for opening the door to peace between the two tribes. Though their plans for unity and retaliation would never ultimately materialize, the diplomacy and political dexterity shown by Victorio in this instance are without doubt belonging to a rarefied strata of achievement and leadership. And, while this particular tale ended well, the times before and after, in which conflicts such as these ended in untold bloodshed and suffering, are too numerous to mention. And the tales of young Herman Lehman, who would eventually kill a medicine man in retaliation for the murder of Carno Viste and escape to join the Comanche, do not end here either. But for now, those are other stories for other times. British Columbia, Canada, June 16, 1811. Aboard the American fur ship known as the Tonquin, fur trader James Lewis lies below deck, mortally wounded. His breathing is labored, and he strains to listen to the native warriors that are just now pulling their long dugout canoes up next to the hulking vessel. He does not know their language, and thus he does not know what they are saying. But he knows why they are here, and James Lewis knows what is about to happen. The chilly waters that surround the vessel situated in Clayoquot Sound were seemingly empty just minutes ago. Now they seem to swarm with war canoes, dozens of them, filled with angered Clayoquot warriors. Soon, the plodding of moccasined footsteps begins to cause a low rumble, as if a thunderstorm is brewing somewhere far away. Lewis begins to feel sick, the noxious effects of his physical state and his psychological distress. But his resolve remains steady. His gaze drops momentarily, and he stares blankly into the roomful of gunpowder kegs outside of which he lies, propped up against one of the sturdy wooden walls of the ship. He again studies the line of dark powder stretching from his position into the room. He is tired. The night before had been the longest of his still young life, in which his thoughts had drifted from his current situation to his family and friends at home, whom he knows he will never see again. He had also had much time to ponder the events of the previous few days, and just how he had come to be here, alone, below decks of this expensive and well-traveled ship. Lewis had been part of a crew of American, French, Canadian, and native fur traders under the employ of the legendary business and real estate mogul, John Jacob Astor. They had traveled to this distant locale in the hopes of trading with the natives for the valuable beaver pelts that were, at this time in the 19th century, a highly profitable commodity. For the next few days, they had anchored offshore of these idyllic lands and bartered a number of profitable trades with the locals. Though the men on board the Tonquin and the local Clayoquot had respective origins thousands of miles away from each other, they were well aware of each other's existence. Though America as a nation extends only to the Mississippi River at this point in the early 19th century, the American fur trade is a globalized industry. The fashionable beaver felt stovepipe hat at this time is all the rage in Europe, as well as the more cosmopolitan urban centers in America. Cafes, parlors, and street corners are all replete with young men sporting their most stylish new headgear. In what might be considered both the height of irony and a wonder of a worldwide supply chain, it is the fashionable fancies of the European upper classes that drive the day-to-day lives and livelihoods of people more than half a world away. Throughout the entirety of North America, fur trappers roam the rivers and streams, hoping to ensnare the valuable animals in their steel traps and send their bounties out to market by way of St. Louis or Santa Fe. And on the open seas, American vessels routinely made the treacherous journey around Cape Horn and up the west coast of North America to the Pacific Northwest, where they traded for furs with local natives. Within a few decades' time, the entire system would implode, as changing fashions and waning beaver populations would prove too much for the market to bear. However, in 1811, there is scarcely a more profitable trade on the whole of the continent, and men are driven to great lengths in their quests to build their fortunes. Perhaps most prominent among these men capitalizing on the fur boom is Johann Jakob Astor, better known as John Jacob Astor, a German-born American immigrant who had capitalized on the Jay Treaty that was signed by the United States and Great Britain in 1794. The treaty opened new markets in the Great Lakes region as well as in Canada. Astor signed a contract with the Northwest Company based in Montreal. Astor would import the furs from Montreal to New York, and then ship them to Europe to be purchased by hat manufacturers. By the turn of the 19th century, he had amassed a fortune of roughly $250,000, over $6 million by today's standards when accounting for inflation. However, in 1807, the U.S. Embargo Act was enacted by Congress, closing off trade with Canada and severely disrupting Astor's business dealings as his connections in Montreal were now illegal. In response, Astor obtained direct permission from President Thomas Jefferson to establish the American Fur Company, which he did in 1808. Over the next few years, Astor would use the American Fur Company, or AFC, as well as its subsidiaries, to gain control of virtually the entirety of the Great Lakes region, as well as secure several lucrative contracts. Intending to hamper his former employer in the Northwest Company, as well as the juggernaut of the industry in the Hudson's Bay Company, Astor soon began to finance expeditions to the Pacific Northwest in hopes of monopolizing the fur trade with the natives there before his rivals could gain a foothold. This had been the driving force behind Astor's purchase of the Tonquin. In 1810, Astor created the Pacific Fur Company, a subsidiary of the American Fur Company, to expand into the Northwest with intentions to both explore the territory and to establish favorable relations with the natives. Astor had purchased the Tonquin, a 290-pound bark, 96 feet in length, and outfitted to carry 22 cannons, from the Fanning and Coles Company, who had sailed the ship to China to trade for cheap goods in 1807. Astor purchased the vessel for $37,860, roughly $700,000 today, on August 23, 1810. He hired the most experienced fur traders he knew, mostly Scottish and French-Canadian voyageurs, who had long plied their arduous trades amongst the natives of the Great Lakes region. And to command the ship, Astor sought out the services of a short-tempered and staunchly disciplined ex-U.S. Navy captain named Jonathan Thorn. Born in Schenectady, New York on January 8, 1779, he was the first of 15 children born to Samuel and Helena Horn. He became a midshipman in the U.S. Navy at age 21 in April of 1800. Thorn participated in the Tripolitan War, also known as the First Barbary War, in 1801. Thorn was part of a small group of volunteers that accomplished the dangerous mission of sneaking into the harbor at Tripoli, Libya, and destroying the captured American frigate known as the Philadelphia on February 16, 1804. On August 3rd of that same year, Thorn also participated in the attack on Tripoli Harbor led by Commodore Edward Preble. He was commended for his conduct during the engagement and was given command of one of the captured gunboats. While serving in the New York Navy Yard, he was promoted to the rank of full lieutenant in February 1807. At the time, Thorn was the youngest naval officer to ever command a United States naval yard. Still, despite his relatively rapid ascension within the ranks of the Navy, Thorn's correspondence to friends and family at the time betray a young man internally besieged by self-doubt and various physical ailments. Thorn would serve in the Navy until 1810, when he was granted a 2-year furlough in order to sign on with John Jacob Astor for a job as captain of the Tonquin. But as much as Astor's thought processes were logical, he would simply hire the best, most experienced men he could for each position. They lacked an overall accounting for the variability of human temperaments, perspectives, and experiences. And, unfortunately for the men embarking on the Tonquin, there were scarcely two cultures more at odds than that of Captain Thorn's disciplined navy and that of the purely pragmatic, often romanticized voyageurs. The Tonquin set sail from New York City on September 8, 1810, carrying a crew of 34 men. They rounded Cape Horn and stopped off in Hawaii before arriving at the mouth of the Columbia River on the 22nd of March, 1811. During the entirety of the journey, Captain Thorn had proven increasingly at odds with the voyageurs. They found him wildly overbearing, while he found them slothful and disorganized. Thorn saw his obedience to the orders of Astor as his primary responsibility, while the voyageurs viewed themselves as skilled and knowledgeable tradesmen who had hired on for a job they intended to do well. However, they had no intentions nor inclinations to adhere to what they saw as the captain's overly strict policies and timelines. En route to the Pacific Northwest, Thorn's adherence to schedule was tested beyond what he considered to be reasonable bounds. On December 4, 1810, when the Tonquin had pulled into Port Egmont in the Falkland Islands in order to gather supplies and make minor repairs, 8 men had ventured into the interior of the islands in hopes of procuring more provisions. When they proved slightly tardy on their return, Thorn saw fit to sail away with the remainder of the crew and leave the 8 men stranded on the remote island. Desperate and with little other option, the 8 men struck out desperately in their rowboat in hopes of catching up with the Tonquin. After 6 exhausting hours, the men in the rowboat managed to come within sight of the Tonquin. One of the crewmen, a man named Robert Stewart, threatened to kill the captain should he not turn around to rescue the men and the rowboat. Thorn, rightfully taking the threat quite seriously, obliged to Stewart and his cohort's demands, and the 8 crewmen were subsequently rescued. While Thorn had seen the action as a necessary imposition of discipline, the trappers and crewmen, who were not military men, saw it as a dishonorable and wholly condemnable action. Thorn, for his part, had become increasingly frustrated with the laissez-faire attitude of the fur traders. He found the jovial atmosphere they created as inappropriate, dismissive, and even dangerous. By the time the Tonquin sailed into the waters of Hawaii's Kaleakua Bay on the 12th of February 1811, the crew and the captain were seemingly irreparably at odds. Though he was a stalwart disciplinarian, Thorn did see the necessity in maintaining at least some semblance of cordiality between himself and the crew. So, while in Hawaii, Thorn finally made a temporary peace between himself and the senior partner fur traders. Thorn recruited 24 Hawaiian Kanaka laborers to assist in the day-to-day work that awaited the crew of the Tonquin upon their arrival in the Pacific Northwest. The Tonquin left Hawaii behind on March 1, 1811. 3 weeks later, on March 22, 1811, the ship came into sight of its most formidable challenge yet, the Columbia River. Among the tasks that Thorn had been charged with by Astor was the building of a permanent trading post near the critical geographical point where the Columbia River pours into the Pacific Ocean. Even today, the swirling, raging waters of the area provide a daunting task for sailors in modern-day vessels to navigate. But Thorn was unmoved by the fearful sight of the violent, churning waters. His concern was only the task at hand. Thus, on a particularly stormy day, he ordered 5 men to cast out in a rowboat and make their way into the middle of the waters to sound the bottom or determine the depth of the water so that the larger ship could find a spot on the formidable sandbar deep enough for it to get through. The terrified men beseeched Thorn with heartfelt pleas for their lives, as they saw venturing into the turbulent waters before them as tantamount to suicide. J.C. Fox, a veteran Boston sailor and Thorn's first mate, was appointed to lead the task. He was ordered to take a crew composed of 3 French Canadians who had never been to sea before, and an aging Yankee sailor who would be of marginal use at the oars. He protested vociferously to the captain, who only dismissed the terrified young man by turning his back to him and remarking that if he was so afraid of water, he should have stayed in Boston. Thorn ordered them to carry on, insisting that he needed all of his experienced sailors to man the ship in the midst of the repressive squall they were currently enduring. Ultimately, Fox mournfully obliged. He sorrowfully addressed his comrades, saying that his uncle had left his bones at the bottom of this channel only a year before, trying to make the treacherous crossing himself, and that now he would join him. It would be only minutes later when the boat would capsize amidst the waves, killing all 5 men on board. 3 days later, on the 25th of March 1811, another crew of 5 men was ordered to repeat the same mission that had killed their unfortunate comrades scarcely 48 hours earlier. Their small rowboat met the same fate, being capsized in short order amidst the crashing waters. However, this time, one American crew member and one of the Hawaiian Kanakas managed to miraculously make their way to shore after a horrifically harrowing ordeal that saw both nearly succumb to drowning and then hypothermia. The next day, the Tonquin was able to navigate past the sandbar, laying anchor in Baker Bay. Thorn and the remaining members of the crew then came ashore. Over the succeeding few weeks, the crew of the voyageurs and the remaining Hawaiians would construct a trading post. This post would blossom into an economic hub and is today the town of Astoria, Oregon. As they labored, much of the conversation amongst the men was conducted amongst themselves in their native tongues, so as to be indiscernible to Captain Thorn. But it was clear to the captain, from their tone alone, that the crew were nearing a mutinous fervor. Still, the mission carried on. As the months passed, trade was carried out with curious locals, such as the Clatsop people, a Chinookan tribe that had been encountered by the Lewis and Clark expedition in 1805. Thorn pressed the Clatsop for information on any of their neighbors to the north who might be open to trading as well. He was referred to the Cleoquiot tribe, who resided around the Cleoquiot Bay some 430 miles to the north. The Cleoquiot, meaning the people from Cleoqua or Cleoqui, had recently engaged in peaceable trading with a number of European merchants. They were a hunter-gathering people, descendants of the Nunchanuls. Scant years before, in the late 1700s, they had engaged in prolonged and vicious intertribal warfare in efforts to rid their territories of foreign invaders from rival nations. Thorn was encouraged by the potential profit source and dismissive of any military threat that might be posed against his superiorly armed men aboard their state-of-the-art ship. And so, on June 5, 1811, the Tonquin again crossed the sandbar, leaving the waters of the bay and heading north, again, towards current-day Vancouver, British Columbia. As they traveled north, they stopped intermittently to come ashore and trade with other tribes along the way. During one of these stops, they hired a local native named Hosea Kiao to serve as their interpreter as they continued on northward. Thorn was again cautioned against venturing into the Cleoquiot's territory, as they had recently had some tense dealings with other European traders. Thorn, again, dismissed any threat posed by the natives paddling cedar canoes and wielding homemade war clubs against his mighty and well-armed vessel. During the second week of June, the Tonquin finally made its way into the waters of Cleoquiot Sound. Alexander Mackay, the most experienced Scottish fur trader on board the ship, and Hosea Kiao went ashore to establish relations with the Cleoquiot. They were received peaceably, even being welcome to stay the night in the chief's longhouse. The next day, as Mackay and Hosea Kiao established trade on shore, a number of Cleoquiot canoes went out to the Tonquin in hopes of bartering for more goods than Mackay and Hosea Kiao had brought with them. Before leaving to come ashore, Mackay had cautioned Captain Thorn of this eventuality, and warned him not to let too many Cleoquiot on board at once. Thorn, wholly inexperienced in trading with natives save for his most recent dealings in the past few weeks, brushed Mackay's concerns aside, again reassuring him that the Tonquin's might rendered it practically invincible to native attack. As curious Cleoquiot clambered on board, Thorn ordered several blankets spread out on deck and trade goods laid upon them. Believing himself a shrewd bargainer, Thorn attempted engaging a Cleoquiot elder, a chief known as Nukami, in trade. He offered 2 blankets, an assortment of beads, and a number of metal fishhooks in exchange for 1 otter pelt, an offer he felt to be more than charitable. Nukami, however, was an experienced and shrewd deal-maker, a veteran of countless dealings with Europeans and other natives throughout his long life. He rejected Thorn's offer outright, scornfully condemning it as egregiously low. Nukami insisted on 5 blankets. Thorn saw this as outright extortion. He angrily turned his back to the chief, stalking off towards his quarters. The chief, indignant himself, followed the captain, taunting him for being such a weak bargainer and waving the otter pelts in the air. Incensed, the captain grabbed one of the furs and, according to varying accounts, either struck the chief with it or rubbed it in his face, shouting, "Damn your eyes!" He subsequently threw Nukami and all of his cohorts off of the Tonquin, and sent word from Mackay and Hosea Kiao to return. Mackay was horrified at the captain's pomposity, and the experienced traders in the crew now all believed themselves to be in great danger. They insisted that now was the time for the Tonquin to pull up anchors and to take its leave, but Captain Thorn would hear none of it. Just after sunrise on the following morning, a singular canoe appeared on the water, pulling up next to the Tonquin. Captain Thorn, as well as much of the rest of the crew, was still asleep. The Cleoquiot inside the canoe held up furs and made overtures of peace towards the crewmen on watch, who were convinced to let the small ship come aboard. Captain Thorn, as well as Mackay and Hosea Kiao, were summoned to the deck, and trading was commenced. But soon, more canoes began to flock to the Tonquin. At first, just a few, but then more, and then more. Again, Mackay and Hosea Kiao beseeched Captain Thorn to only allow a small group of Cleoquiot on board at a time. Again, Thorn dismissed their concerns wholeheartedly. Hosea then noticed that many of the Cleoquiot warriors wore fur mantles draped over their necks and shoulders, a curious wardrobe choice considering the warm June weather. Yet again, the captain roundly condemned the idea of being caught off guard by a surprise attack. Finally, the number of Cleoquiot on board the Tonquin became unmanageable, and yet still, the canoes continued to pull up next to the Tonquin. Finally, Thorn was forced to order the decks cleared and the topsails unfurled, and the anchor weighed. The mood on board the ship, and that of Thorn in particular, was rapidly devolving from one of joviality to one of panicked suspicion. As the preparations were being made to move, and the Cleoquiot were being ushered off the Tonquin and back into their canoes, James Lewis, acting as the ship's clerk, had been hunched down next to a bale of blankets, taking stock of inventory. Suddenly, a startling, bone-chilling war cry rang out, piercing the muggy summer air. The Cleoquiot chief standing next to Lewis brandished a large hunting knife, burying it deep into the unfortunate American's back. Lewis fell forward into the ship's companionway, alive but grievously wounded, and a massacre ensued on board the Tonquin. McKay, standing nearby, was the only crewman who had broken the typical policy which barred anyone from carrying arms above deck without explicit permission, and snuck a pistol into his waistband. With the advent of the attack, McKay, the seasoned, strong-willed Scotsman, pulled the weapon and made use of its single shot in disposing a lone Cleoquiot warrior. The other warriors immediately leapt upon McKay, bludgeoning him mercilessly with the war clubs they had concealed beneath their furs. McKay was then tossed, barely alive, into a canoe where he was dispatched by Cleoquiot women with large oars. Next to fall was Thorn, who in fact fought valiantly and viciously with a pocket knife he kept on his person as he made a desperate bid to get to the cache of weapons kept on board. He managed to eviscerate 4 of his assailants, though he suffered several grievous wounds in the process. He, too, was soon felled by a mighty strike from a war club. The bulk of the pitiable crew on board were then cut and clubbed down over the next few minutes, as the Cleoquiot exacted their revenge for the captain's disrespect. Every sailor on the decks was killed, save for the native translator, Hosea. Also still alive was James Lewis, who had dragged himself into the shadows and hidden for the remainder of the attack. Now satisfied, the Cleoquiot took what goods they fancied most and returned to their canoes, rowing across the placid, chilly waters as the imposing Tonquin now sat still, with its crew cold in death. However, in a miraculous oversight, the Cleoquiot had overlooked the 7 sailors who had climbed into the ship's rigging to unfurl the topmast. After the Cleoquiot made their exit, the sailors made their way to the deck, and then below deck, where they found the dying Lewis. Lewis, resigned to his fate, had told the remaining survivors to cast out in one of the rowboats, and that he would stay behind. He burned for revenge against the Cleoquiot, and sought to make his last act his retribution. He requested only that he be left with a line of gunpowder stretching from where he lay to the ship's powder magazine, which contained nearly 9,000 pounds of gunpowder. He would wait until they returned the next day, which all assumed to be a certainty, as there was still so much valuable loot left on board. Then, he would blow the ship up. This, he hoped, would create time for his cohorts to escape and eliminate as many of their pursuers as possible. After jarring farewells, the men left Lewis alone with his thoughts as they slipped away in the rowboat. And now, here he sits, retching in pain and smiling to himself as the ship grows heavier and heavier with the weight of the Cleoquiot climbing on board. Before long, roughly 200 warriors swarmed the deck and hulls of the once mighty vessel, now but a carcass to be scavenged. Perhaps Lewis takes one last look at the brilliant British Columbia sky, or thinks once more of his upstate New York home, or the Hawaiian Islands, the Falklands, the bar rooms of New York City, or the beaches of Oahu. Then, as Hosea watches from the shore, unaware that there are any survivors at all, the Tonquin erupts in what is likely the largest explosion that will be seen in the Pacific Northwest until World War II's battle for the Aleutian Islands. A din of grief and horror erupt from the Cleoquiot assembled on shore as a giant fireball consumes what is left of the Tonquin within minutes. Not only is this a tragedy for the Cleoquiot, but the explosion has not served its secondary purpose in providing a distraction for the escaping sailors. According to Hosea, they are soon blown to shore by a fierce gale and captured. In retribution for the killing of their tribesmen, the sailors are summarily tortured to death. It will be weeks later when word finally reaches Fort Astoria, passed on by reluctant natives who now seem to be inexplicably fleeing the area. Save for Hosea, who is now a prisoner of the Cleoquiot, there are no survivors. The entire crew of the Tonquin, as well as the ship itself, have been lost. Word will make its way to Astor, who will find himself much aggrieved, but more determined than ever to establish a trading foothold in the territory. But the many tales of Astor's ambitions, as well as those of the plight of the peoples of the Pacific Northwest who will suffer untold hardships in the years to follow, are, for tonight, other stories for other times. July 27, 1816. Along the Apalachicola River in the panhandle of Spanish Florida stands Negro Fort, a structure built just 2 years prior by the British to serve their cause during their failed reclamation of the United States colonies in the War of 1812. Within the confines of the fort stood a diverse contingent of Choctaw natives and fugitive slaves from Spanish and American colonies. They are locked in a defensive struggle to hold the sanctuary from an incursion by American Brigadier General Edmund Pendleton Gaines, his 116 Army soldiers, more than 150 Coweta and Creek allies, and a small command of U.S. gunboats. The fugitive slaves, many of whom fought alongside the British in the War of 1812, held out hope that the island empire would return to their relief. But the British, having been repulsed in the war, would have no further strategic interest in coming back. The colonial fugitives, led by a 30-year-old former slave, a skilled carpenter who fled from Spanish-held Pensacola, going only by the moniker Garçon, had informed the Americans and their native allies that they would accept nor offer any quarter, for they knew the intentions of the Americans to return them back to their quote-unquote legal owners into bondage. After weeks of preparation, skirmishing, and terse deliberations, the Battle of Negro Fort would come to a catastrophic and horrifying end, as several hundred lives of the men, women, and children within the timber walls of the fortification would at once come to a furious and fiery end, stamped out in an instant with a single emphatic explosion of powder and iron that would scarce be seen in this era of human combat. The demographic landscape of the territory now encompassing the current American state of Florida had undergone a series of drastic alterations in the 3 centuries preceding this battle. Beginning in the early 1500s, the Spanish Empire would undertake the first major European land claim within North America. They would establish a small number of forts and settlements at St. Mark's, St. Augustine, and, in the west, Pensacola, but would not establish considerable settlements beyond the trifecta of territorial anchors. The Florida mainland had once been a thriving, interwoven network of native peoples, but, along with the Spanish expeditionary missions, came a host of infectious diseases that devastated these indigenous populations, rendering much of La Florida sparsely populated for years to come. To the north of Florida, in territory that now largely belongs to the states of Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi, were the still thriving Creek people. The Creeks did not have a traditional hierarchical structure. Instead, they had an interwoven confederacy of clans, tracing their lineage all the way back to a single maternal ancestor. The various clans would, by principle, intermarry with one another, creating an enduring bond and tying them all together in what has been described as, quote, the rope of sand. Yet, the multi-generational tapestry these native clans had long enjoyed would face a civilizational crisis that came not from the European settlers' diseases, but rather their way of life. In the 1700s, what could broadly be described as, quote, high-status Creeks began to trade for and utilize African slaves to the benefit of the Creeks' agrarian way of life. They would farm cotton on their own plantations, and some Creeks would amass significant wealth in comparison to their centuries-long history that came before these cross-Atlantic influences began to reshape their society. While the, quote, rope of sand had connected the clans together and given them a shared interest of which to defend against attacks by settlers and rival tribes alike, it was without a truly authoritative figure atop the tribal structure. With no way to rule for or against this use of human chattel, a schism occurred within the various clans, and several Creeks would relocate to South Florida. Due to the depopulationary events of the prior Spanish plagues that ravaged the local native peoples, land for these withdrawing Creeks was readily abundant. The Spanish would refer to the newly arrived natives as Seminole, meaning runaways or wild ones. This would, over time, evolve into the name they are known by to this day, Seminole. They would establish communities that implemented European-style farms and ranching, and, informed in part by their divergence from the Creeks, they would grow in size as a haven for escaped black slaves, whether they were, quote, owned by American, Spanish, or even Creek entities. These, quote, black Seminoles would adopt the way of life of the welcoming natives, who required they maintain their own settlements, offer up tributes of crops annually, and fight alongside the Seminoles against their American adversaries. The disputes between the United States and the, quote, Red Sticks and Creeks, of whom the Seminoles were born from, dated far back into the past, with many attacks, skirmishes, and uprisings occurring in what in hindsight appears to be a never-ending conflict. Most recently, the Red Stick War was fought over the course of a year, spanning from the summer of 1813 to the summer of 1814. It was both a territorial dispute between the empires of the United States, Spain, and Great Britain, but also was effectively a civil war among the Creeks. The war would be ended with the signing of the Treaty of Fort Jackson, resulting in Andrew Jackson securing the surrender of 21 million acres of land in southern Georgia and central Alabama, at the cost of 2,000 casualties, the majority of which belonged to the alliance opposing the United States. With factions within factions fighting one another, and the presence of European nation-states forming alliances with and against themselves and various tribes as the ever-evolving situation saw fit, it is fair to say that the layers of nuance held within each particular conflict that occurred over the territory of North America can at times carry upon itself a dense veneer of murky indistinguishability. What the Red Stick War undeniably managed to do, however, was bring the Seminole Nation into the direct focus of General Andrew Jackson and the United States government. For context, General Jackson had famously demolished the British invasion of New Orleans just 18 months prior to the grisly events that would occur at Negro Fort, and the Seminole proclivity for both assisting the British as well as harboring fugitive slaves had been a significant point of contention for Old Hickory. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 authorized the government to seize and return escapees to their owners and incur penalties against those who aided in their fight. This would serve as a pretext for the actions the United States would authorize in their expedition into the Spanish-held territory. The fort that held several hundred escaped slaves who had worked with the British in the War of 1812, having been built by the Brits in 1815, stood in present-day Franklin County in the Florida Panhandle. If Jackson wanted to mobilize a force to attack the fort, he would need the authorization given to him by the current commander-in-chief, James Madison. Madison had previously authorized force to support rebellions against Spain by residents of West Florida. While he had first exercised patience and restraint in the matter, by March of 1816 he ordered Jackson to inform the governor of West Florida, Mauricio de Zuniga, that the laws of nations required them to come together to, quote, put an end to an evil of so serious a nature. Ultimately, the decision would fall to Madison on whether force would be used to take the fort and if it needed congressional approval. Andrew Jackson did not wait, and instead would set forth the military operation that would result in the assault on Negro Fort. Jackson wrote to General Gaines telling him, quote, you possess the power of acting on your own discretion, which I hope you will exercise on this. West Florida Governor Mauricio de Zuniga would respond to Jackson's earlier correspondence regarding the Negro Fort that, quote, The Spanish government needed to destroy or remove from our frontier this banditti, put an end to an evil of so serious a nature, and return to our citizens and the friendly Indians inhabiting our territory those Negroes now in the said fort and which have been stolen and enticed from them. This response further emboldened Jackson to take actions to address Negro Fort. The operation began the last week of June 1816 with U.S. gunboats and schooners headed for Apalachicola Bay. Arriving on July 10th, they carried with them guns, provisions, and supplies. The gunboats weighed upward of 25 tons. They each carried 50 sailors with several large cannons stretching over 60 feet in length. The destruction per capita offered by these vessels was practically unrivaled. The naval vessels would meet up with Allied Creek Chief Lafarca at the mouth of the Apalachicola. Colonel Clinch had ordered them to hold their position, and he then began his movement south from Camp Crawford with 116 men on July 17th in well-armed and reinforced flatboats. Clinch would link up with Chief William McIntosh and his 150 Coweta warriors. He then added another detachment of Creeks the following day, under the command of Mad Tiger. The arrangement between Clinch and the native chiefs in regards to compensation was $50 for every captured slave. The natives were also given the right of first refusal when it came to looting the fort after its capture. The first shot of the Battle of Negro Fort was fired on July 15th, as the advance of gunboats and schooners of the Americans saw a group of men pulling a small vessel out of the water ahead of them. One American boat went forth to approach the party, and was fired upon with a volley of musket balls that struck into the boat. 2 days after this, Sailing Master Loomis sent a small boat with 4 sailors up the river in search of fresh water. They spied a black man standing alone on the riverbank, then docked their vessel and went ashore to speak with the man. And just as they had done so, no fewer than 40 black and native men appeared brandishing muskets. With them was their commander, Garçon. They opened fire and took the lives of 3 of the sailors at once. Another sailor, John Lopez, was wounded but managed to escape via swimming the waters of the river. The worst fate would, however, fall upon the man they captured, Edward Daniels, who was taken to the fort, heavily tarred, and then burned alive. Over the coming days, varying reports of success had been documented regarding the ability of the American native forces to capture fleeing slaves, one of whom held the scalp of Edward Daniels in his hand when he was overtaken by McIntosh's Coweta warriors. He was on his way to show off his trophy to the Seminoles as proof of their actions and the hostilities that were now underway. The next several days were, in relative terms, fairly uneventful. The defenders of Fort Negro used the artillery and weaponry within the structure to keep the encroaching men at a distance. Shot, shell, grape, and rockets would serve as a capable deterrent, but would do little to inflict significant damage upon the American native allies, who were content to let the fortification burn through their munitions as they took cover. The black defenders of the fort at one point launched an offensive raid against the Coweta warriors. The engagement was conducted at such close quarters that muskets were of little effect, with the bulk of the ferocious fighting being undertaken with tomahawks and knives. These clashes persisted for the better part of 3 days, before the Coweta gained a clear advantage, and the black, Maroons as they had often been called, made their return within the fort. The American Dr. Buck would recount after observing this gruesome, days-long clash of hand-to-hand fighting, "Even though they were Indians, Negroes, and our enemies, it was clear that they were determined to fight to the end, and never to be taken alive." McIntosh would then destroy all of the fruit, corn, and livestock surrounding the fort, and a small collection of native leaders approached the fort to demand it be surrendered. The party was met with considerable disdain, and the leader, Garçon, informed them that he had been left in command by the authority of the British government, and his orders were to sink any American vessels who attempted to pass beyond them. Though it had been over a year since the British had abandoned the fort and the War of 1812 ended, they still held out hope that they would be reinforced and relieved by the British in time. Surrendering was of little incentive, as they were aware of the objective of the American native forces to return them to their, legal slaveholders. On the 26th of July, Clinch's army and Loomis's navy would finally be joined together several miles below Prospect Bluff. Then, a detachment of soldiers was sent to the rear of the fort to join the Cowitas under McIntosh. The following morning, on the 27th, the gunboats would be positioned along the river within cannon shot of the fort. This brought a cannonade upon the American native positions from the guns within the fort, but it did little damage. The position of his gunboats, however, was described by Loomis as, quote, point-blank range. For the next hour, the sides exchanged voluminous cannon fire, with neither gaining a clear advantage. It wasn't until the American sailing master upon gunboat 154 began to heat the shells with a makeshift furnace that the battle would be abruptly decided. The red-hot cannonball was launched from the vessel, cutting through the dewy, dense air of the Florida summer morning with devilish intent. It passed high above the fort's outer perimeter and crashed directly into the gunpowder magazine arsenal. Instantly, a deafening eruption that was said to be heard as far as 100 miles away ignited in an enormous fireball that could be seen high above the walls of the fortification, at once immolating, concussing, and launching into the air hundreds of men, women, and children that inhabited the structure. Dr. Buck would somberly recount this dreadful exhibition. Quote, "You cannot conceive, nor I describe, the horrors of the scene. In an instant, hundreds of lifeless bodies were stretched upon the plain, buried in sand and rubbish, or suspended from the tops of the surrounding pines. The soldiers, while relieved with the almost instantaneous resolution to the battle, were taken aback by the utter devastation they had just laid bare." Buck continued, "They checked their celebrations to drop a tear on the distressing scene." Accounts of the casualties vary amongst primary sources, but the consensus lies that roughly 300 individuals described as fugitive slaves and at least 25 of their Choctaw allies were present within the fort during the explosion, with roughly only 25 of them in total surviving the battle's concise and fiery conclusion. McIntosh's Cowitas began butchering all of the black survivors of the explosion quite literally before the dust had even settled. Colonel Clinch would hurry into the ruins of the fort and pled for the massacre to cease. Some feel he did this because it appealed to his sense of humanity. Others state that he merely wanted them alive because they were rightfully the property of slave owners, and it was his mission to return them. Improbable as it was, Garçon and a nameless Choctaw had survived the blast. Immediately upon their apprehension, they were tried for the murder of the 4 sailors at the outset of the battle. In their final act of defiance, they took responsibility for the killings and were promptly scalped and shot. Seminole leader Neamathla was angered by the destruction of the fort that caused the death of the members of his people. He would send a warning to General Gaines that should his forces cross the Flint River, they would come under attack by the Seminoles. General Gaines would respond by sending a detachment to arrest Neamathla, which would erupt in a barbarous confrontation. After the Battle of Negro Fort, all of the pieces were finally in place for the First Seminole War, and what would follow would invoke a series of utterly jarring acts of violence. But the tales of depredation and destruction in the First Seminole War are, for tonight, other stories for other times. South Kingston, Rhode Island, December 19th, 1675. Just after 1 o'clock in the afternoon, an army of over 1,000 Puritan English settlers with more than 150 Mohegan and Pequot allies marched through whipping winds and snowfall across an ice-encrusted swamp towards a fortification of thousands of Narragansett warriors, tribal elders, women, and children under the leadership of their sachem, Comanche, who English leaders would refer to as a most perfidious villain. The contrasting civilizations were on the precipice of one of the most horrific scenes to take place in all of King Philip's War. But first, how did it come to this? June 20th, 1675. On this day, Philip, otherwise known as Metacomet, a Pokanoet chief and sachem from the Wampanoag people, began a bloody and barbarous conflict between a coalition of native tribes loosely assembled under his vision against the New England Confederation, comprised of the Puritan colonies of Massachusetts Bay, Plymouth, and New Haven. The Puritan colonies had adopted this confederacy to create a defensive force against the Dutch colony of New Netherlands, as well as the native tribes of the northeast region. Philip had come into power after the death of his father Massasoit in 1662. While Massasoit and his people had a relatively peaceful relationship with the settlers, assisting them, trading, and cohabitating the land, Philip's reign would mark a decidedly different approach. The crux of this change in diplomatic relationships can be traced to the treaty proffered by the colonists to the natives in 1671, which included the conditional surrender of all native arms. The English settlers sought to expand their security and dominion over an area in which they were vastly outnumbered through these escalating demands built into their treaties. The terms had damaged the relations between the sides, and the forcing function would finally occur in the spring of 1675, when 3 Wampanoags were hanged in Plymouth for the murder of a member of their own tribe. Hostilities would officially commence one fateful day in late June, a date tribally significant due to the summer solstice, when a band of Pokanokets raided several rural homesteads in Swansea in the Plymouth colony of what is now present-day Massachusetts. These attacks would continue for months, with fierce fighting amongst colonists and natives taking place, as atrocities were committed as acts of retribution from one side to another again and again. The New England colonies would draft an ever-increasing contingent of men into service for the defense of their interest, and would align themselves with Mohegan, Mohawk, and Pequot natives. In October of 1675, Massachusetts Bay Colony held a diplomatic meeting with Comanche, the sachem of the Narragansett tribe, and they signed the, quote, Treaty of Neutrality. The tribe had sought to remain impartial during the conflict. However, repeated visits from Pequot sachems who endeavored to gain the involvement of Narragansett warriors in the war and their precariously close location to Puritan settlements brought great angst and uncertainty to the colonists living amongst them. In early November, Governor Josiah Winslow would lead a contingent of Plymouth, Massachusetts, and Connecticut militia against the Narragansett tribe, burning their villages as they marched through Rhode Island, driving the Narragansett east towards the shore. The Narragansett had been found to be harboring refugees from the belligerent Wampanoag tribe of what is today eastern Rhode Island, and the colonists demanded they be turned over to them. After several rounds of start and stop deliberations, the Narragansett ultimately declined the colonists' request. Stonewall John, the Narragansett leader, then broke off peaceful negotiations with the colonials. His name, ironically, did not come from his style of diplomacy, but rather his incredible skill as a mason. On December 15th, after the dissolution of treaty talks, the Narragansett attacked the Giray Bull blockhouse, a fortification constructed of stone. 15 soldiers who were defending the fort would perish in the attack. 3 days later, on December 18th, the night before the Great Swamp Fight, had arrived. It was a cold, bleak, and snowy night. Divisions from Massachusetts, Plymouth, and Connecticut of the New England Confederation joined together at Pettaquamskin, below Tower Hill, near the water's edge. The Massachusetts and Plymouth units marched through Richard Smith's trading post upon the way, using the harbor that was there to mobilize food, munitions, and supplies for the campaign. The Massachusetts counted 500 men, including a cavalry of 70 mounted soldiers. The Plymouth counted 150 men. The Connecticut added 300 Englishmen along with 150 Pequot and Mohican native auxiliaries. This substantial force of more than 1,000 was not made up of pacifist settlers. It was a hardened band of men who had seen vicious combat, some of which was gained during previous battles during the still young King Philip's War. The force also included veterans of the astonishingly fatal English Civil War. Narragansett scouts had made the presence of this mobilizing force known to their people. They also reported that it was growing in number and positioned dangerously close. It was made clear to the Narragansett that the mission of the New Englanders was to ratify a treaty with the Narragansett that would keep them out of King Philip's War. The people of Rhode Island, aware of the bloodshed that had been taking place throughout New England in this conflict, became increasingly uneasy about the large Narragansett population so close to theirs. While small skirmishes had taken place amongst the New England companies and the Narragansett, they would pale in comparison to the coming Great Swamp Fight. The critical intel needed by the New England militia to take action was the exact location of the Narragansett. While at Wickford, Rhode Island, a small settlement in North Kingston, the English captured and interrogated a Narragansett native. Under threat of death, the Narragansett revealed the whereabouts of his people. The Narragansett believed swamps made for ideal locations to take up defensive positions. With their natural conditions designed to bog down an advancing force, they had built a fortification within the Great Swamp near South Kingston, Rhode Island, south of Narragansett Bay. Just before dawn on December 19th, a bitterly cold morning, the colonial force made their way to the Great Swamp, led through the snow by the Narragansett saboteur who had informed them of the location under the threat of execution. Had the scout not led them through, it would have been nearly impossible for the New England regiments to come upon the site of the Great Swamp fortification. Through the early hours of the day, the men marched over Tower Hill, across the Chepauchet River, heading for the Great Swamp. The conditions were so frigid that several of the men began to freeze, and had to be carried back to the site of their encampment. While the inclement conditions were a hindrance to the men on their journey, they would play a fateful role in allowing them to cross the Great Swamp, as the frozen march allowed them to travel with comparative ease to the conditions of the locale throughout the rest of the year. The discovery of the swamp being frozen lifted the spirits of the men, and shifted the strategy to that of one of immediacy, accompanied by a more aggressive tone. Narragansett scouts opened fire upon the men as they spotted them in the woods near the swamp. Several skirmishes broke out, and the New Englanders fought their way to the opening of the Great Swamp. The men finally laid their eyes on the fortification. Large, upright cedar posts anchored the structure, reinforced with banks of clay brushed up into the timber like grout. Just in front of the fort were piles of brush stacked up as a breastwork, and large trees laid end to end. Captain Mosley and his Massachusetts company were in the front of the column, and rushed after the retreating Narragansett scouts, pursuing them to the opening of the fort. The Massachusetts men were met with a resounding fire from the entrenched Narragansett's flintlock muskets, which were used with lethal accuracy, as well as torrents of oncoming arrows. Fierce fighting continued, and the militiamen from the Old Bay State took heavy casualties as they drove forward into the endless fire of the warriors. The men were driven back into the swamp, and Captain Mosley, who was known to the warriors from previous engagements, would tell the governor after the assault that he saw 50 warriors aim at him through the course of the battle. Governor Winslow, the acting general of this colonial force, ordered the Connecticut to charge forward and support the pummeled Massachusetts column. A narrow opening in the front of the fort was the target of the advancing colonials, with it viewed as the weak point by the men as they locked eyes on the fort. It had in front of it a single large tree, laid on its side as a blockade, but the tree held little efficacy in stopping the English from getting to the front of the structure. Amidst the blistering pace of action that had now overtaken the once serene winter terrain, the fighting moved in around a series of tightly placed wigwams. It was ordered that the wigwams be set ablaze, causing several Narragansett people, including women and children, to be driven out by the flames and shot dead by Puritan muskets. The battle could have been lost for New England had the Narragansett not run out of gunpowder, sparking a dramatic shift in the course of the battle. After this, it was inevitable that the colonials would overcome the native attempts to repulse them. As dusk arrived, after an argument amongst the English colonists, with some calling to camp outside the structure and wait for daybreak, it was determined that they would set fire to the fortification. The densely populated fortification went up in a roaring symphony of flames, illuminating the evening sky as the scorching fire consumed the lives of many of the women, children, and elderly who inhabited the fortress. The vast majority of the tribe's winter supplies were also destroyed in the attack. Many of the Narragansett warriors had given up their positions and fled from the scene when the battle appeared lost, trekking through the woods long before the fire had been set. After the destruction of the fort, the surviving Narragansett people were also in the woods surrounding the icy swamp, and the English sought to make an escape into the cold and dark landscape before an attack could be delivered upon them by the reorganizing warriors. Hundreds of the Narragansett wounded, warrior and civilian alike, died in the piercing conditions in the woods surrounding the swamp. The sachem, who was within the Narragansett tribe, returned the following day and buried all of the dead. First-hand accounts of the number of Narragansett women and children killed range from 100 to 150, while some historical accounts deduce it would have reached into the several hundreds when all was said and done. The English took as many of their dead as they could carry back to Wickford. The men they couldn't carry were left on the ground, and the sachem of the Narragansett would do the work of burying them as well. The colonists would lose many of their officers during the siege, with roughly 70 men killed in total, and another 150 wounded. Unsurprisingly, the Massachusetts regiment took the brunt of the casualties. The dead and wounded would be evacuated from Wickford to Aquidneck Island, a settlement in Narragansett Bay, where they would be looked after by Rhode Island colonists. The exact location of the Great Swamp Fortress remains disputed amongst archaeologists and historians to this day, with just a simple obelisk statue now acknowledging what transpired. Many have spoken of an unnerving, supernatural presence that can be felt on visits to the desolate location where hundreds were slain and buried throughout the swamp. For many years after the events, bones were visibly protruding through the soft, misshapen earth, painting a macabre landscape to serve as a grisly reminder of the events that took place there 3.5 centuries ago, and nearly brought a people to an end. The following spring, a vicious counteroffensive orchestrated by Comanche would be launched, with over 2,000 natives from a multitude of tribal denominations. It would engulf the Rhode Island capital of Providence in flames and escalate the diabolical conflict even further. But for tonight, that, along with the other many unnerving tales of King Philip's War, are other stories for other times. May 18th, 1754. Colonel George Washington stands at the bottom of a rocky gulch after a brief yet grisly shootout amongst an encampment of French-Canadian troops and Washington's 40 Virginia militiamen joined by a dozen Iroquois warriors. The clash would end as a resounding victory for young George Washington, with over a dozen killed for the French and the rest surrendering. After the final shots had rang out in the early morning hours of the battle, Tanacharishon, known as the Half-King, a Mingo chief, had viciously killed the French officer Joseph Couillon. However, this victory would come at a heavy price in the not-so-distant future. Washington's men fell back to the Great Meadows, a broad open field enclosed by a distant tree line the colonel had used to make camp before the Battle of Humonville. Colonel Washington, aware of a pending reprisal by the French, instructed his men to drive their spades into the earth and begin construction, with what little resources they had available, of a defensive outpost that Washington dubbed Fort Necessity. Washington had been charged with leading this Virginia militia group to stave off encroachment of the Ohio country by New France. Though just 22 years of age, the hand of fate had a way of exalting the young Virginian into remarkable circumstance. On May 31st, Colonel Joshua Fry, Commander-in-Chief of Colonial Forces, fell from his horse and died, putting George Washington in full command of the Virginia troops. The next day, the 1st of June, Governor Dinwiddie sent a letter to Washington stating the encounter at Humonville was a resounding success, dispelling any concerns Washington may have had that his actions would be looked upon negatively. Dinwiddie would write, "I heartily congratulate you, as it may give testimony to the Indians that the French are not invincible when fairly engaged with the English." Dinwiddie would address his superiors abroad with a different tone, stating that Washington's forces had been merely auxiliary to the Half-King, and that the natives were the aggressors in the skirmish, given that the colonials were purely on a defensive assignment. 200 more Virginia militiamen arrived the first week of June, soon followed by an independent company from South Carolina bringing 100 British regulars and 40 beef cattle to feed the men. While those in France looked upon Washington as an assassin, higher-ups in London used this opportunity to label him and his fellow provincial officers as untrustworthy, and Washington's desire to be regarded with the same esteem of the British royal officers suffered a blow because of his actions. Captain Mackay arrived with 100 men on June 14, and he made clear to Washington that he was not beholden to any orders given to him by the colonial officer. Mackay and his men camped outside the walls of the fort in the Green Meadows. Washington had been promised 50,000 pounds of flour by the middle of June, but the provisions would never arrive, straining the resources of a regiment of several hundred men. Washington set out towards Fort Redstone, the location of Christopher Gist, struggling mightily on the trek as they lost numerous horses and were repeatedly hamstrung by broken-down wagons along the way. While at Fort Redstone, Washington and Tenasharashan met with Delaware, Shawnee, and Mingo representatives, all of whom declined to further involve themselves with the British in this dispute. The Half-King felt the shift in tone went beyond neutrality and that the other tribes may be prepared to fight alongside the French. The Ohio natives were disinterested in shedding blood on behalf of the British to expel the French, only to be put out further by colonial expansion into their territory. Washington would reveal his thoughts on the natives in his journal after this diplomatic summit. Treacherous devils, who were sent by the French as spies, who would turn against us at any time. The Half-King likewise stated that Washington took it upon himself to command the Indians as slaves, and refused to take advice from the Indians. The natives also believed that Fort Necessity was a poorly located, designed, and fortified structure, with Tanasharashan referring to it as that little thing upon the meadow. On June 28th, Washington orders his men inside the makeshift circular fort after receiving reports that a force of 800 French, along with 400 natives, were slated to attack their position. While the numbers were inflated slightly, this represented a contingent with 7 times the manpower available to Washington. The man leading the French troops held a strong personal interest in the matter, Louis Couillon de Villiers, the elder brother of the slain Joseph Couillon de Jumonville. He had begged his superiors for the chance at retribution against Washington's men. While the haphazardly constructed fort itself created vulnerabilities for Washington and his men, they had also gone without bread or meat for a week's time now, and had since subsisted on meager rations of spoiling corn. The small confines of the fort, just 50 feet in diameter and only capable of housing 50 to 60 men, required trenches to be dug out of the walls to provide additional cover for the reinforcements that had arrived with Colonel Mackay, thus creating a series of breastworks on all sides of the structure. With 9 small cannons inside the fort to act as the primary defense and deterrence, the fort was surrounded by trees and elevated terrain just a few dozen yards away from its walls. The wooded landscape gave greater cover to an attacking force, as well as ceding them the high ground. These far less than ideal conditions to place a fort would be steadfastly defended by Washington for the rest of his life, having viewed the area as more of a camp and staging area for an offensive campaign than an impenetrable fortress. The young colonel was nevertheless about to learn a devastating lesson in battlefield strategy, whether he would admit it or not. On July 3, 1754, word came to Washington that a sizable force of French-Canadian militiamen were sighted less than 4 miles from Fort Necessity. While Colonel Washington was unaware of it at the time, the French troops had trekked through Jumonville Glen on their way towards Fort Necessity and stumbled upon the unburied, scalped, and decaying bodies of their fellow countrymen. This would inflame their bloodlust to a fever pitch. Just before 11 a.m., this hostile ensemble of French and Indian warriors came down upon Fort Necessity, marching forward in 3 columns. Their shouts and battle cries filled the air before being drowned out by musket and cannon fire from the British allied men who scattered the columns apart as they frantically fell back into the woods. Washington had anticipated engaging in a more traditional form of combat, one viewed as dignified at the time, of well-uniformed men standing toe-to-toe in a field, firing upon one another in turns. But he would today receive a lesson in a style of guerrilla warfare that would shape his combat knowledge. He would call it Indian fighting, with the emphasis on surprise, cunning, and merciless ambush, to inflict abrupt damage often followed by a retreat before a counterattack could be waged. He would carry this calamitous lesson with him throughout his time as the first commander-in-chief of the U.S. Army during the Revolutionary War, exploiting the soft underbelly of his opponents wherever it presented itself. The French-Canadian detachment kept a constant fire upon the composite force of British and colonial men. From every tree, stone, and stump, Couillon's forces nailed precision shots from behind cover and inflicted heavy casualties while taking almost none themselves. After several hours of this onslaught, the sky let loose a torrential rain, turning Fort Necessity into a soupy mire, filling trenches with cumbersome mud, and with no roof or covering of any kind on the fortification, the armory within it was drenched by the downpour. and became increasingly unreliable until the colonial Britons lost the capacity to even return fire as dark fell upon the great meadows. Looking upon this scene from overhead made for a truly pitiful sight. With over 100 colonial British casualties, nearly a third of all Washington's men, bodies strewn amongst crimson puddles of earth and sludge, dead or mercilessly dying, death showing its prejudice to neither animal nor man, having taken the lives of all the livestock and dogs in the vicinity as well. The Franco-Indian force more than just dominated the battle, their actions were akin to wholesale slaughter, leaving a scene of chaotic destruction while suffering only 3 killed of their roughly 1,200 men. To compound the embarrassment for Washington, the Virginia militiamen broke into the fort's liquor supply, becoming stone drunk, wilting under the hopelessness of their circumstance. On the contrary, His Majesty's regular troops stood tall in the face of this adversity, showing a marked difference in professionalism and ability between the veteran force of the British troops and the ragtag band of transients that made up the bulk of the colonial militia. Washington would furthermore go on to detest the mixing of his troops and alcohol after this intoxicated display. Just as it seemed the French-Indian coalition could at any moment descend from the trees and kill them to the last man, a French officer came out of the woods, anxiously walking toward the fort, waving a white flag, offering to discuss the terms of a potential surrender of the colonial British. Washington and Mackay selected their French interpreter Jacob von Braun to parley terms of their surrender, among them that the men would be released to return back to the colonies should they agree to not return to the forks of the Ohio for a minimum of 1 year. But even more geopolitically important was that Washington would sign a document, albeit one that was poorly translated to him by von Braun, that stated that the attack on Fort Necessity was in retaliation for the, quote, assassination of Humanville. This key phrasing, assassination, was included in the surrender unbeknownst to Washington and Mackay, as they signed off on the agreed-upon terms, hearing instead from von Braun that it had been, quote, death or loss, or a more neutral characterization of the slaying of Humanville. Washington's inadvertent admission would be used as a key component of propaganda throughout France and all the territories she held, labeling Washington as a nefarious, antagonistic killer, and giving the French Empire the public support needed to mobilize against British colonial encroachment in North America. To further hasten the shame he faced, Washington's personal journal was commandeered and would be mass-printed and distributed widely through France. Upon reading this journal, Governor Duquesne, the French administrator of New France, would laugh and openly mock what he thought of as the feeble-minded Virginian. In spite of all this, Washington displayed an unflappable resolve during the firefight, never flinching as the bullets whistled by his head and the bodies of his militiamen continued to pile up around him. He kept his focus on the moment, giving and carrying out orders as the ever more dire situation called for. This loss would be a bitter pill to swallow, but one that would serve as crucial in shaping him into a formidable general in time. The strength of the forces presented in the Ohio country, so vastly in favor of the French, were not reflective of the composition of North America. The whole of New France had a mere 75,000 inhabitants, while the British colonies were home to a population of 1.1 million, as well as 300,000 black slaves. Governor Dinwiddie would use the events of Fort Necessity as a call to arms for his fellow royal governors throughout the colonies, but would stir up little interest from them and their abundant populace. The reports on the battle Dinwiddie sent to London would be received far differently. King George II viewed the Ohio country as the keystone to westward colonial expansion beyond the Appalachian Mountains. He would commission Major General Braddock to sail to the shores of Virginia with 2 regiments the following year to unite with the colonial forces and wage a campaign of aggression on multiple fronts to ruthlessly drive out the French incursion. But for tonight, those are other stories for other times.
Eastern Idaho, 1832. As bullets whizzed by them and the sounds of gunshots filled the air, a group of Blackfoot warriors urged their galloping horses towards a small lake ensconced in the mountainous terrain. Behind them, in hot pursuit, ride several American fur trappers, firing their single-shot rifles and pistols to the best of their abilities while riding atop their galloping mounts. With little option in the way of escape, the small group of Blackfoot warriors take to the frigid waters of the small lake. Here,
With their horses in water up to their withers, the warriors now launch arrows towards their attackers. The fur trappers in hot pursuit are momentarily stalled, not wanting to risk bogging their horses down in the water by furthering their attack. They retreat to a position on the banks of the small body of water under cover of the area's abundant timber. From here, they trade shots with the waterlogged Blackfoot, assuming their quarry to be trapped and all but assuredly doomed. But this Blackfoot hunting party the trappers have happened upon are in fact only one small part of a larger band of Blackfoot camped only a few miles away. When one warrior on a particularly fleet pony makes his way back to their village, reinforcements are quickly gathered, and in mere minutes, a force of hundreds of Blackfoot warriors are mounted and charging out of the camp towards their brethren who are trapped in the waters of the lake. Soon, it is the American fur trappers who are on the defensive, as the newly arrived Blackfoot reinforcements pour over the hilltop behind them. At the head of the attack is a Blackfoot chief named Eagle Ribs. He is a member of the Buffalo Society and among the very few warriors allowed to wear the horns of the buffalo as a headdress. He rides in front of his warriors, all among them incensed at the trappers' attack. In the preceding few months, the Blackfoot had killed numerous fur trappers in the area, along the Yellowstone and Gallatin rivers. They are, without question, the most feared tribe among the trappers here on the northern plains. The Blackfoot are a powerful warrior tribe, the ruling power here on the northern plains, a title they have earned through years of ruthless expansion after the introduction of the horse to their people sometime in the 17th century led to a veritable explosion in capabilities in both hunting and raiding. Now, as they turn the tide of the trappers' attack, a shudder flows down the spines of the once bellicose mountain men, as all among them know that, while being killed by the Blackfoot will surely be a terrifying end, it will pale in comparison to the agonies that await them should they be taken alive. Now, under a hail of arrows and bullets, the trappers are forced to retreat from their position, abandoning their attack and riding back towards their own camp several miles away. Just minutes prior to their arrival, the camp had been a typical scene of activities, with men carrying out chores, repairing equipment, and checking their inventories. But as the first riders fleeing the Blackfoot race into camp, the routine of the morning is quickly broken, and it is readily apparent to the trappers that they will now have to take immediate action in a fight for their lives. Now, the men amongst the trappers' forces will soon face the full might of the Blackfoot's martial prowess brought to bear on them here in the middle of the wilds of the Idaho mountains. Among the trappers is 28-year-old Jim Bridger, one of the most experienced among them, and for all intents and purposes, their elected leader. Bridger has seen more of the American West than most living men. Born James Felix Bridger in Richmond, Virginia in 1804, Bridger had come west like so many countless other American young men in the early 19th century, in search of adventure and fortune. As a teenage neophyte to the frontier, on his first trapping expedition, Bridger had been part of the Seminole Ashley's 100 fur trapping expedition that set out from St. Louis in 1823. While on this initial foray into the world of the mountain men, Bridger had been one of the 2 men charged with remaining with Hugh Glass after his now infamous misfortune of being severely mauled by a mother grizzly in present-day South Dakota. Glass, a legendary trapper in his own right, and already a noted veteran by the time Jim Bridger arrived on the frontier, had been so badly wounded that his comrades, unable and unwilling to linger in a dangerous hostile native territory for what they saw as an exercise in futility, had left Bridger and another trapper named John Fitzgerald to remain with Glass until he inevitably expired from his wounds. But as Bridger and Fitzgerald fretfully waited hour after hour in the frigid, dangerous territory for their comrade to finally succumb to his condition, he proved amazingly and frustratingly resilient. Though he appeared to continue to decline, Glass simply refused to die. After their nerves had been sufficiently rattled by the prospect of being captured alive by hostile natives, they had weighed their options and chose, regrettably, to leave Glass to his seemingly inevitable fate. They had eventually made their way back to civilization, where the young Bridger had joined up with another fur company, and Fitzgerald had gone on to join the army. But Hugh Glass did not die. Instead, In a feat that is now etched in the annals of frontier legend, he managed to survive and effectively drag himself hundreds of miles to the nearest fort, where his wounds were treated and his life miraculously saved. Once recovered, Glass had eventually sought revenge on Bridger and Fitzgerald, but found Fitzgerald now under the protection of the U.S. Army, and Bridger to be just a teenage boy. He ultimately forgave the youngster and Fitzgerald out of the charity of his own heart. Despite this relatively inauspicious start, Bridger would remain undaunted in his pursuit of life as a mountain man. In the fall of 1824, he would become one of the first white men to explore the Yellowstone region of present-day northwestern Wyoming. Here, he was one of the first Americans to lay eyes on the parting of the waters at Yellowstone Lake. In 1830, he was part of a group that bought out the legendary Jedediah Smith's stake in what would come to be known as the Rocky Mountain Fur Company, a trapping outfit composed of several members of Ashley's 100 who sought to contest the powerful John Jacob Astor's monopolist American Fur Company. By 1834, however, with the decline of the beaver population and growing difficulty in turning a profit in the fur trade, the Rocky Mountain Fur Company was bought out by the American Fur Company and absorbed into Astor's corporate structure. In 1835, Bridger had married a woman named Emma from the Flathead tribe, a people who resided in the ranges of what is today western Montana and eastern Idaho. The couple would ultimately have 3 children together, necessitating, or perhaps excusing, Bridger's constant excursions with fur trapping companies into increasingly less profitable and increasingly dangerous territories. In this year of 1836, Bridger and his troop of fur trappers are on their way to the yearly rendezvous that will be held in present-day Idaho at a place called Pierre's Hole. The rendezvous is an annual tradition amongst the mountain men and local tribes, one that affords all a brief, fleeting respite from the drudgeries and dangers of life on the frontier. The furs and hides that had been so arduously gotten in the preceding year would be traded and sold. Goods and supplies would be bought and bartered for, and all could partake in the ample good food and drink. Songs, dances, gambling, gossip, as well as romantic liaisons between lonely mountain men and native women, all abounded. Though not the debauched and overtly drunken scene that is often portrayed, the yearly rendezvous was a lively and exciting affair. Bridger, as well as the rest of the mountain men in camp, had long looked forward to the affair, and now, with the rendezvous only days away, it had briefly seemed to all that they could almost taste the flowing hard cider and freshly baked breads. However, now, any thoughts of rest and recreation are quickly dashed as the influx of their comrades riding at full speed pours into the camp. The cry of "Blackfoot!" quickly spreads throughout the camp, and now Jim Bridger and the rest of the trappers scramble to their single-shot rifles and make ready for the fight to come. The trappers take their positions in a loose battle line facing the direction of the approaching Blackfoot, and, for a few eerie moments, they can only hear the thundering hooves and war whoops of the warriors rapidly closing in to make their attack. Then, suddenly, the war party crests the top of the hill overlooking the campsite. Seeing the defensive line of mountain men protecting the camp, the Blackfoot pause atop the hill, just outside of rifle range. For a harrowing few minutes, a nervous tension permeates the air, as both parties wearily appraise the size and strength of their opponent's forces. However, as the nervous trappers eye the sizable war party atop the hill in front of them, one amongst their party carefully and excitedly searches the lines of the mounted warriors, hoping to see a familiar face. She is the wife of one of the trappers, a Mexican man named Loretto, who had bartered for her freedom a number of years earlier after finding her as a prisoner of the Crow. She is, in fact, a member of the Blackfoot tribe. Though taken from her people as a young woman, she is intimately familiar with Blackfoot culture and customs, and, having not visited this territory for several years, might very possibly be a long-lost relative or friend to the attacking Blackfoot. While she finds no comfort in searching for a familiar face, what happens next brings a brief glimmer of hope to herself and all amongst the trappers. Calmly and coolly from atop the hill, Chief Eagle-Ribs now rides forward with a small group of warriors, bearing a pipe of peace and gesturing for the trappers to send a group of their own to discuss peace negotiations. Now, Jim Bridger enlists the help of the Blackfoot woman to act as an interpreter, and Bridger, the woman, and a small group of trappers now make their way towards the expanse between the two lines, all the while wary of a surprise attack from the Blackfoot. As an off-putting silence overtakes the battlefield, it seems to many present that all that can be heard is the plodding of the two parties' horses towards one another. As he rides in front of his group, Bridger begins to scan the line of Blackfoot warriors to the rear of Eagle Ribs and his contingent, growing increasingly concerned as he nears the spot where the proposed negotiations are to take place. In only a precious few seconds, his suspicions overtake him, and as he, the other trappers, and the Blackfoot woman are mere yards away from Chief Eagle Ribs and his men, with the chief now extending his hand in a gesture of peace, Bridger attempts to quietly pull back the hammer on his single-shot rifle. But in the tense silence that has befallen the would-be battlefield, the minute action resounds with a voluminous click, audible to all of those present, especially to Chief Eagle Ribs. The Blackfoot chief instantly grabs the barrel of Bridger's rifle and thrusts it towards the ground. As he does so, Bridger attempts to pull the trigger and shoot the chief, but his bullet merely fires harmlessly into the dirt. Now, a violent struggle ensues between Bridger and Chief Eagle Ribs, and within moments, the entirety of both parties, with the exception of the Blackfoot woman, are in a full-pitched fight. As Bridger and the chief fight from atop their horses, another Blackfoot warrior sends an arrow whipping through the air and slamming into the small of Bridger's back. Moments later, a second arrow strikes just above the first, both projectiles embedding themselves deeply into the unfortunate man's torso. With Bridger now reeling in pain, Eagle Ribs now seizes the rifle from his hands and strikes Bridger from his horse with a powerful blow that Bridger at first assumes to have broken his neck. For her part, the Blackfoot woman takes this opportunity to flee back to the lines of the trappers and her husband and infant child. The Blackfoot warriors, however, quickly thwart her escape, cutting off her path and driving her back towards the Blackfoot. The distressed young mother now becomes irate, screaming inconsolably to be allowed to return to her child. The Blackfoot at first appear unmoved, but after recognizing her as a member of their own people, Chief Eagle Ribs instructs the young woman to call out to her husband and ask him to bring the child to her. He assures her that her husband and child will not be harmed. Minutes later, the nervous young father plods cautiously across the veritable no-man's land that lies between the trappers' lines and the Blackfoot. He assumes that he will likely be killed as soon as he reaches the Blackfoot, but drives himself on in hopes of at least delivering the child to her mother. To his surprise, he arrives at the Blackfoot lines unharmed and is allowed to hand the child over to his wife. However, this is where the charity of Eagle Ribs and his warriors has been exhausted. The man is instructed to now leave his wife and child and return to the trappers. He is promised that he will be left unharmed as he crosses and that his wife and child will be cared for. The unnerved trapper now makes his way, again, across the expanse of mountainous prairie, feverishly wondering if he has seen his young family for the last time. For the time being, it appears that he has, as the Blackfoot now take their newly returned tribal sister and her child with them as they sink over the hills and into the wilderness. The befuddled, heartbroken young father can only watch on. Meanwhile, though the Blackfoot have now left the battlefield, Jim Bridger's troubles have only begun, as the 2 arrows lodged deeply in his lower back now cause him excruciating pain with even the slightest movement. As his blood-soaked shirt is cut away, it is apparent to his attending brethren that extracting the arrows will be a difficult, painful process. While one of the arrows is pried free with relative ease, the second remains lodged immovably. The arrows employed by this band of Blackfoot are steel-tipped, acquired from trade with the British. Unlike their stone predecessors, these tips do not break or shatter, but bend and hook upon impact, making the extraction of a warped arrowhead all but impossible. After several excruciating attempts, the decision is made that the arrowhead will have to be left. The mountain men present, acting as rudimentary though serviceable physicians considering the circumstances, agree that any further surgical incursion into the wound by their untrained hands will only cause more damage. And so, the bent steel arrowhead is left where it has struck, embedded in the soft tissue of Jim Bridger's lower back. In this pitiable condition, Bridger is now forced to endure the agonizing ride to the rendezvous. The long-awaited trip is all but spoiled for the young mountain man, as his pride is also significantly wounded, having suffered not only the arrow wounds, but the theft of his rifle by the Blackfoot chief Eagle Ribs. Though Bridger is able to turn a substantial profit for his year's worth of trapping, the limitations of his condition only serve to dampen his spirits. But this will not be the last time that the legendary Jim Bridger will meet with the feared and fearsome Blackfoot. Though he will carry the arrowhead in his back for the remainder of his life, Bridger will return to the frontier in only a matter of weeks, and over the course of the succeeding years, he and his trapper cohorts will meet the Blackfoot in countless brutal confrontations in the fight to control the northern plains. But the many stories of the fabled life of Jim Bridger, as well as the countless instances of heroism, ferocity, selflessness, and tragedy that will occur in the battles between the mountain men and the Blackfoot in the years to come, are, for tonight, other stories for other times. Thank you again for joining us on this episode of History at the OK Corral. Be sure to click the like button, share this episode with a friend, and become a subscriber. Also, if you'd like to support our work and gain early access to episodes as well as ad-free viewing, you can become a member of this channel by clicking on the join button below. And we'll see you next time on History at the OK Corral, home of history's greatest shootouts and showdowns.